There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a man who has crushed everything soft in his life finally meets the thing he cannot break. It is not the silence of respect. It is the silence of a crowd watching a blade swing and not yet knowing whose neck it will find. On the night of the winter masquerade, that silence belonged to Duke Cedric Ashcombe, a man who had spent 14 years building an empire on the bones of everyone who loved him. And if you think you know what happened next, stay. Because the version the kingdom told itself was a fairy tale. The truth was a butchering. The chandeliers inside Blackthorn Palace hung like frozen constellations, 300 pounds of Valdoran crystal suspended from chains that had not been replaced since Cedric's grandfather bled the northern provinces dry to pay for them. The light they cast was not warm, it was surgical. It carved the faces of 600 guests into sharp angles and deep hollows, making every smile look like a wound and every laugh sound like something rehearsed in front of a mirror that morning. The ballroom itself was an act of violence dressed in gold leaf. 40-foot ceilings, marble floors polished until they reflected the underside of every gown, every boot, every nervous shuffle of a minor lord who had borrowed money he could not repay just to afford the invitation. The winter masquerade was not a party. It was a census of power. You attended to prove you still mattered. You stayed to make sure no one forgot it. And at the center of it all, standing near the grand staircase with a glass of Auvergne red in his left hand and the full weight of his reputation in his posture, was Duke Cedric Ashcombe. I was 41 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of aristocratic engineering, broad shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been designed by a man who hated softness, and eyes the color of wet iron. He wore a black velvet coat with silver thread stitched along the collar, and he wore it the way a general wears a medal, not for decoration, but as evidence. His hair, dark and streaked early with gray at the temples, was pulled back and tied with a silk cord. He did not wear a mask. He never did. The masks were for people who needed to hide. Cedric did not hide. Cedric displayed. "You are staring at my wife again," he said without turning his head. Lord Aldrich Morn, a thin man with a pointed beard and the permanent expression of someone who had just swallowed something sour, flinched beside him. "I beg your pardon? Evelina, third column from the left. Blue gown, silver mask, standing alone as usual. You have looked at her 4 times in the last 10 minutes. Cedric sipped his wine. "Is there something about my wife that interests you, Aldrich?" Morn's throat moved. "She looks well tonight. She looks the same as she always looks. Quiet, decorative, forgettable." Cedric set his glass on the tray of a passing servant without looking. "If you're going to admire something in this room, admire the woman who actually deserves it." He tilted his chin toward the east wing of the ballroom, where Lady Seraphine Vale was holding court among a cluster of senior ministers and their wives. She was laughing at something, or pretending to laugh, which was the same thing in this world, and the sound carried across the marble like a bell designed to make other bells feel inadequate. Her gown was crimson, her mask was gold. Her neck was bare except for a single ruby pendant that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in fragments, as if the stone itself was too proud to hold someone else's glow. Morn said nothing. He had learned, as every man in the Duke's circle eventually learned, that there were conversations with Cedric Ashcombe and there were performances by Cedric Ashcombe, and the only way to survive both was to become furniture. Cedric watched Seraphine the way a man watches a fire. He started on purpose. There was pride in it, ownership, but also something else, something that lived in the space between his ribs and his spine, something that tightened every time she turned her head, and he could not immediately identify who she was turning it toward. He did not call it jealousy. He called it awareness. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular, and crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted for him. They always did. Not because he was the most powerful man in the room. The king held that title, at least on paper. But because Cedric moved through a space the way weather moves through a valley. You did not decide to get out of his way. Your body simply understood that standing still was not an option. He reached Seraphine's circle and placed his hand on the small of her back. The gesture was precise. Not intimate enough to be scandalous, not distant enough to be dismissible. It was a signature, a brand pressed into the moment for everyone watching to register. "Lady Vale," he said, "you are monopolizing my ministers." Seraphine turned her face toward him, and the gold mask framed her eyes, dark, wide, luminous, like a painting that had figured out how to breathe. "Your Grace." I was simply discussing the Northern tariff proposals. Minister Hale was explaining the revenue implications. Minister Hale, a sweating man with jowls that trembled when he breathed, nodded rapidly. Yes, quite. The lady has a remarkable grasp of— I am sure she does. Cedric's fingers pressed slightly against Seraphine's spine. Walk with me. It was not a request, it was never a request. And Seraphine, who understood the architecture of Cedric Ashcombe better than anyone alive, smiled as though it were. They moved together along the edge of the ballroom, past clusters of nobles who pretended not to watch, and servants who pretended not to exist. The music, a string quartet buried somewhere behind a column of white roses, played something slow and structured, the kind of melody that sounded like mathematics pretending to have feelings. You spoke to Varen tonight, Cedric said quietly. I spoke to many people tonight. You spoke to Varen for 11 minutes. I counted. Seraphine's stride did not change. Her smile did not falter. But something behind her eyes rearranged itself, a flicker so fast that only someone who had memorized her face in every kind of light would catch it. Lord Varen is the new chair of the Treasury Council. It would be unusual not to speak with him. 11 minutes is not speaking. 11 minutes is negotiating. Perhaps I was being thorough. Cedric stopped walking. Seraphine stopped with him. They stood near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, where the snow had turned every hedge and fountain into a ghost of itself. Do not mistake my patience for ignorance, he said. His voice was low, stripped of performance, the voice he used only when the audience shrank to one. I have given you access to this court. I have given you proximity to power that women of your station do not receive. I have made you visible, Seraphine. If you use that visibility to build something behind my back, I will erase you so completely that even the servants will forget your name. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Seraphine held his gaze. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She breathed in, slow and controlled, the way a woman breathes when she is calculating the exact distance between the threat and the exit. Everything I do, she said, I do for you. Everything you do for yourself. That is what I like about you. But do not confuse my admiration with trust. They are neighbors, not roommates. He touched her chin with 2 fingers, tilted her face upward. The gesture was tender from a distance. Up close, it was a leash. Now smile, he said. We are being watched. She smiled. It was flawless. And it was absolutely, perfectly empty. Across the ballroom, standing beside the 3rd marble column from the left in a gown of midnight blue, Duchess Evelina Ashcombe watched her husband touch another woman's face and did not move. She had learned how to do that, how to stand in a room full of people who knew her marriage was a public execution and hold her body so still that she became architecture, a pillar, a fixture, something the eye moved past on its way to the spectacle. It had taken years to master this. The first time Cedric brought Seraphine to a state dinner, Evelina's hands had trembled so badly she dropped a crystal goblet. Cedric had not even looked at her. A servant cleaned the shards. The evening continued, and Evelina learned the first lesson of survival in a palace built on cruelty. Your pain is only real if someone with power acknowledges it. If no one does, it becomes a ghost. And ghosts are easy to ignore. But ghosts also watch. She was 38 years old. She had married Cedric when she was 24, the 3rd daughter of a minor Eastern lord with more land than money and more pride than sense. The marriage was transactional. Her father received debt relief and a title upgrade. Cedric received a wife with the right bloodline, the right temperament, and the right silence. For the first 2 years, she tried to love him. She brought flowers to his study. She learned the names of his horses. She stayed awake waiting for him to come to bed and pretended to be asleep when he finally did, smelling of wine and decisions that did not include her. By the 3rd year, she understood. Cedric did not want a wife. He wanted a frame for his portrait, something that held the edges together and drew the eye to the center, where he stood, always, in perfect focus. So she became the frame. But frames see everything. Frames are present for every conversation, every late-night visitor, every sealed letter that arrives by private courier and gets burned in the study fireplace before the ink is fully dry. Evelina watched. She listened. She remembered. Not because she had a plan, not then, but because memory was the only thing in her marriage that belonged entirely to her. Tonight, she stood with her silver mask pressed against her face and her gloved hands folded in front of her and her heartbeat steady as a metronome, and she watched Seraphine Vale smile at her husband like a woman who had already won. Your Grace, Evelina turned. Lady Margot Duval, one of the few women at court who still spoke to her without pity or agenda, appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "You look like you are attending your own funeral," Margot said. "Drink this." Evelina took the glass but did not drink. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are standing alone at the largest social event of the year, while your husband parades his mistress like a prize horse. That is many things, Evelina, but fine is not one of them. Lower your voice. No one is listening. They are all watching her." Margot glanced towards Seraphine, who was now laughing with a group of generals near the orchestra. She wore crimson, to the winter masquerade. That is not a fashion choice. That is a declaration of war. "It is a dress, Margot. It is the color of the Ashcombe family crest. She is wearing your house on her body. She is telling every person in this room that she belongs to your family more than you do." Evelina's jaw tightened. The muscle near her ear flexed once, then went still. "I am aware of what she is telling them." "Then why are you standing here?" "Because standing here is what I do. It is what I have always done. And it is what keeps me alive in a house where the man who swore to protect me treats me like a piece of furniture he forgot to throw away." Margot stared at her. The champagne in her glass caught the light and trembled. "Evelina, do not." Evelina's voice dropped to something cold and clean, like steel pulled from ice water. "Do not pity me. I have survived 14 years in this marriage by being invisible. If I become visible now, if I react, if I shout, if I do any of the things that this room is waiting for me to do, he wins. He wins because the moment I break, I become the story. And the moment I become the story, everyone stops looking at what she is actually doing." The words hung between them like smoke. Margot opened her mouth, then closed it. "What is she actually doing?" she asked quietly. Evelina finally took a sip of champagne. It was dry and bitter and perfect. "That," she said, "is what I am here to find out." 2 hours later, the ballroom had reached that stage of the evening where the alcohol had dissolved the pretense and people began saying things they would regret by morning. Minor lords argued about land disputes. Young officers flirted with married women near the garden doors. The music shifted to something faster, more reckless, as if the orchestra could feel the mood turning and decided to match it rather than resist. Cedric stood in his private alcove on the upper gallery, looking down at the floor below. From here, the guests looked like chess pieces, color-coded, predictable, moving in patterns they believed were spontaneous but which repeated themselves every season. He had attended 31 winter masquerades. He could predict, within 5 minutes, when the first scandal would erupt, when the first drunk lord would need to be escorted out, and when the king would retire early with a headache that everyone knew was not a headache. "You are brooding." Seraphine appeared behind him, 2 glasses of wine in her hands. She had removed her mask, and without it, her face was harder, more angular, the softness replaced by the geometry of a woman who had engineered every moment of her ascent. "I am thinking," Cedric said. "Same thing, with you." She handed him a glass. Varen agreed to the adjustment. The northern tariff will pass the council next week with the new provisions. Cedric took the wine but did not drink. "What did you offer him?" "Access. He wants a seat at the spring summit. I told him you would consider it." "I will not consider it. Varen is a fool with a title he inherited from a father who was slightly less foolish. Putting him in the spring summit would be like putting a child in a war room." "A child who controls the treasury," Seraphine said smoothly, "and who, as of last month, has the ear of General Draven." Cedric's eyes moved from the ballroom floor to her face. "Draven." "Draven has been cultivating allies on the council, quietly. The kind of quietly that means he is planning something loud." "How do you know this?" Seraphine sipped her wine. "Because I make it my business to know things that you are too proud to ask about. Draven met with 3 council members last Tuesday. Private chambers. No scribes. No records. The only reason I know is because one of his guards owes me a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that does not survive daylight." Cedric stared at her. There was a quality to Seraphine that he had never found in any other person, man or woman, in his entire life. She operated without morality. Not immorally, like a child who does not understand the rules, but post-morally, like a surgeon who has cut into enough bodies that the concept of squeamishness no longer applies. She did not do good things or bad things. She did effective things. And she did them with a precision that made him feel, in his most honest moments, slightly afraid. He would never admit this. Not to her. Not to anyone. A man like Cedric Ashcombe did not experience fear. He experienced strategic awareness. If Draven is building a coalition, Cedric said slowly, then we need to know who is in it before the spring summit. Already working on it, but I need something from you. What? The Pemberley land grant. The one you have been sitting on for 3 months. Sign it. Give it to Lord Harwick. Harwick is useless. Harwick is married to Draven's sister. Sign the grant, and Harwick becomes grateful. Grateful men talk, and their wives talk more. Cedric set his glass down on the stone railing. Below, the ballroom spun with color and noise and the mechanical joy of people performing happiness for each other. He looked at Seraphine and thought, as he often did, that she was the most dangerous person he had ever chosen to stand next to, and that the choice to stand next to her instead of running from her was either the smartest or the most catastrophic decision of his life, and he would not know which until it was too late. I will sign it tomorrow, he said. Tonight. I have it in my quarters. It will take 30 seconds. You brought a legal document to the masquerade. I bring everything I need everywhere I go. She tilted her head. The candlelight from the gallery sconces painted half her face in gold and left the other half in shadow, and Cedric thought, not for the first time, that she looked like two different women fused into one body, each one waiting for the other to make a mistake. You are extraordinary, he said. He meant it as a compliment. It came out like a diagnosis. Seraphine smiled. I know. They left the gallery together, his hand on her back again, her stride matching his, two predators moving through a building full of prey who had dressed themselves up as guests. They passed through the eastern corridor, where the portraits of Ashcombe ancestors stared down from gilded frames, with eyes that seemed to follow and judge. Cedric never looked at them. Evelina always did. They did not notice, as they turned the corner toward the private wing, the small figure in a blue gown standing in the shadows of the stairwell, watching them disappear. Evelina stood there for 17 seconds. She counted them. Counting was a habit she had developed during the first year of her marriage, a way to impose structure on moments that threatened to dissolve into chaos. 17 seconds to breathe. 17 seconds to press her fingernails into her palms, hard enough to leave crescents in the skin. 17 seconds to remind herself that rage was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Her steps were measured. Her posture was perfect. Her face, behind the silver mask, was absolutely unreadable. But inside her chest, behind the architecture of composure that she had built brick by brick, over 14 years, something was shifting. Something heavy and slow and patient, like tectonic plates grinding against each other miles beneath the surface of the earth. She had felt it before. Small tremors, microfractures in the foundation of her tolerance. But tonight it was different. Tonight it had a direction. Tonight it had a name. It was not anger. Anger was hot and fast and stupid. This was colder. This was the understanding that every system, no matter how powerful, has a structural weakness, and that the people who build those systems never guard against the weakness they refuse to see. Cedric's weakness was his certainty. He was certain that his power was absolute, certain that Seraphine was controllable, certain that Evelina was irrelevant. And certainty, Evelina had learned, was just ignorance wearing a better suit. She re-entered the ballroom and found Margot exactly where she had left her. Where did you go? Margot asked. Nowhere. I need you to do something for me. Anything. Lord Varen's secretary, the one with the limp. His name is Tomlin. I know Tomlin. Nervous man. Drinks too much at these things. Find him. Bring him to the South Terrace in 20 minutes. Tell him the Duchess wants to discuss a private matter regarding his mother's pension. Margot blinked. His mother's pension? His mother was a seamstress in the royal household for 30 years. She was dismissed without payment when the Treasury reforms passed last spring. Tomlin has been writing letters to every office in the capital trying to get her money. No one has responded. How do you know this? Because I read the letters, every one of them. They were thrown away by Minister Hale's office. I had them collected. Margot stared at her. There was something in Evelina's voice that she had never heard before. Not desperation, not sadness, something architectural, something with blueprints. Evelina, what are you doing? I am doing what I should have done years ago. She removed her mask. In 14 years of attending the winter masquerade, the Duchess of Ashcombe had never once removed her mask before midnight. The face beneath it was not beautiful in the way Seraphine was beautiful. It was not a weapon, not a spectacle. It was the face of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that the underestimation itself had become her armor. "I am collecting what is owed," she said. In the private wing of Blackthorn Palace, in a room with velvet curtains and a four-poster bed that Seraphine had never been officially assigned, but which everyone understood was hers, Cedric signed the Pemberley land grant with a quill that cost more than most families earned in a year. He did not read the document. He had not read the last 6 documents Seraphine placed in front of him. This was not laziness. It was delegation. He delegated to people he trusted, and he trusted Seraphine because she had never, in 3 years, given him a reason not to. This was the flaw, not the trust. Trust between predators is a reasonable survival strategy. The flaw was the assumption that Seraphine's interests and his own would always align, that the woman who had climbed into his bed and his court and his decision-making process with the efficiency of an invading army was climbing toward him and not past him. "There," he said, pushing the document back across the desk. "Done. Thank you." Seraphine folded the parchment and slid it into a leather case that she kept in the bottom drawer of the writing desk. Cedric noticed, without remarking on it, that the drawer contained at least a dozen other documents. This was not unusual. Seraphine managed half his correspondence. She was better at it than his official secretary, which was one of the many reasons the secretary now reported to her. "Come back to the ball," he said. "The king will make his toast at midnight. I need to be visible." "You are always visible, Cedric. It is the rest of us who have to work at it." He caught something in her tone, a thread of bitterness woven so finely into the silk of the joke that most people would not have felt it. But Cedric was not most people. He had built his career on hearing the things people tried to hide inside the things they said. "Something is bothering you. Nothing is bothering me." Seraphine. She stopped folding the leather case. Her hands went still. In the candlelight, her shadow on the wall was enormous, twice her size, consuming the bookshelf and the window and the edge of the ceiling. "Your wife looked at you tonight," she said. "My wife looks at me every night. She has been looking at me for 14 years. It is what wives do." "No, she looked at you differently. When you touched my face in the ballroom, I saw her eyes." Cedric sighed. It was the sigh of a man who considered his marriage the least interesting problem in his portfolio. "Evelina is harmless. She has been harmless since the day I married her. She knows her position. She accepts it. Acceptance and surrender are not the same thing. In her case, they are." Seraphine looked at him. The thing about Seraphine Vale that most people missed, the thing they missed because they were distracted by the crimson gowns and the ruby pendants and the architecture of her ambition, was that she was genuinely intelligent. Not clever, not cunning, but intelligent in the way that a cartographer is intelligent. She could look at a landscape and see not just what was there, but what the terrain would force to happen next. "You have never been afraid of the wrong people, Cedric," she said, "and you have never been afraid enough of the quiet ones." "Is that a warning?" "It is an observation. Keep your observations about my wife to yourself. She is not your concern." The words hit Seraphine like a door closing. She heard the lock turn. She recognized, as she always did, the exact moment when Cedric's pride sealed itself shut, and no amount of logic or evidence could pry it open again. She had seen this before. She had worked around it before. She would work around it again. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, and the title in her mouth was an ornament, a courtesy wrapped around a blade that she kept sharpened for the day she would need it. They returned to the ballroom separately. This was protocol. Cedric entered through the main door. Seraphine entered through the east gallery. The fiction of discretion, maintained long after everyone in the building had memorized the truth. Midnight arrived with the precision of a kingdom that ran on ceremony. The king, a tired man in his 60s whose crown sat on his head like a headache made of gold, rose from his throne on the elevated platform at the north end of the ballroom and delivered the traditional winter toast. He spoke about unity and prosperity and the enduring strength of the realm, and every word was as hollow as the crystal glasses the guests raised in response. Cedric stood at the front of the crowd, his glass held high, his face arranged in an expression of loyal reverence that he could produce on command. To his left stood General Draven, whose own face was a masterpiece of military blankness. To his right stood Lord Harwick, who was already drunk and smiling at everyone. Behind them all, half hidden by a column of white roses, Evelina stood with her mask in her hand, and her glass untouched, and her eyes on a thin, nervous man with a limp who was making his way toward the south terrace. The toast ended. The crowd cheered. The music resumed. And in the space between one song and the next, While 600 guests drank and laughed and performed the elaborate theater of aristocratic joy, Duchess Evelina Ashcombe stepped onto the south terrace, closed the glass doors behind her, and began to dismantle her husband's world. The south terrace was cold, the kind of cold that strips away pretense and forces the body into honesty, shoulders hunching, breath turning visible, skin contracting against the air as if trying to retreat into the bones beneath it. Snow lay on the stone railing in a thin, perfect layer, untouched, like a page no one had written on yet. Tomlin was already there. He stood with his back to the garden, his coat pulled tight, his bad leg shifted at an angle that suggested pain was a permanent resident in his body rather than a visitor. He was 32 years old and looked 50. That was what 6 years of serving men who did not see him had done to his face. "Your Grace," he said, and the words came out fractured, half frozen. "I was told," Lady Duval said. "Sit down, Tomlin." Evelina gestured to the stone bench near the railing. "Your leg is hurting you." He sat. Not because a duchess told him to, but because his leg was, in fact, hurting him, and the surprise of someone noticing it was enough to dissolve whatever protocol was holding him upright. "I know about your mother," Evelina said. She did not sit. She stood facing him with the ballroom glowing behind her through the glass doors, a silhouette framed by light and noise. "I know she was dismissed. I know the pension was denied. I know you have written 19 letters to Minister Hale's office and received no response." Tomlin's mouth opened. His eyes, already watery from the cold, went wider. "How?" "I have the letters. All of them. They were discarded by Hale's secretary the day they arrived. I had someone collect them before they were burned." You collected my letters?" "I collect many things, Tomlin. Letters, records, receipts that people believed were destroyed. I have been collecting for a very long time." The air between them changed. Tomlin was not a stupid man. He was weak and frightened, and trapped in a system that rewarded obedience and punished curiosity. But he was not stupid. He could hear the gears turning behind her words. He could feel the weight of what she was building. "What do you want, Your Grace?" he whispered. "I want to help your mother. Her pension will be restored by the end of the month. I have already arranged it through a channel that does not require Hale's approval." Thank you. I am not finished." Evelina's voice did not harden. It simply became more precise, like a scalpel finding the exact line of an incision. "Lord Varon, you serve as his personal secretary. You have access to his correspondence, his schedules, his private meetings." Tomlin went pale. The cold was no longer the reason. "Lady Seraphine Vale has been meeting with Lord Varon privately for the past 3 months. You have arranged at least 4 of those meetings. I want to know what they discussed." "I cannot. Your Grace, if Lord Varon discovers..." "Lord Varon will not discover anything, because you are going to tell me what I need to know, and then you are going to go back inside that ballroom and drink champagne and dance with someone forgettable and behave exactly as you do every other night. Nothing changes. Nothing visible. The only difference is that your mother will eat this winter, and next winter, and every winter after that." Tomlin stared at her. Snow was collecting on his shoulders. His breath came in short, ragged clouds. "I am not threatening you," Evelina said, and her voice dropped to something almost gentle, almost human. "I am offering you a transaction, clean and simple. The kind of transaction this court runs on every single day, except that this one actually helps someone who deserves it." The silence lasted 12 seconds. Evelina counted. "They talked about the treasury," Tomlin said. His voice was barely audible. "Lady Vale wanted access to the reserve accounts, the ones designated for military infrastructure. Varon was hesitant. She made promises about trade agreements, about foreign contacts. Foreign contacts. I did not hear the details. They moved to the inner chamber, but I saw the documents she brought. They had seals I did not recognize, not from our kingdom." Evelina's hands, folded inside the fur lining of her cloak, pressed against each other until the knuckles ached. Foreign seals, on treasury documents, brought into private meetings by a woman who shared her husband's bed and her husband's authority, and now, apparently, shared something else entirely with people whose names she had not yet learned. "How many documents?" she asked. 3 that I saw. There may have been more." "Did you see where she kept them?" "She took them with her, always. She never left anything behind." Evelina nodded slowly. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that landed on the terrace like confetti at a funeral. Inside the ballroom, the music swelled into a crescendo, all violins in triumph, the sound of a world that believed it was stable. Tomlin, she said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I am about to ask you is dangerous, not for me, for you. And I will not pretend otherwise, because unlike the people you work for, I do not insult the intelligence of the people I need. He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. Whether from cold or fear or something else, she could not tell. The next time Lady Vale meets with Lord Varen, I need you to make a copy of whatever she brings. Not the originals, just copies. You will leave them in the third drawer of the archive desk in the east wing. I will have someone collect them within the hour. If they catch me, they will not catch you, because the people in that court do not see you, Tomlin. They have never seen you. You are invisible. And right now, in this particular moment in history, invisible is the most powerful thing a person can be. Tomlin swallowed. He looked at the glass doors behind which the ballroom churned with light and power and the oblivious confidence of people who believed their secrets were safe. Okay, he said. Okay. Evelina did not smile. Smiling would have been a performance, and she was finished performing. Instead, she reached into the folds of her cloak and produced a small envelope, sealed with plain wax, no crest. For your mother, she said. Enough to cover this month and next. The pension restoration will follow. Tomlin took the envelope with both hands. His fingers were shaking, not from the cold. Thank you, Your Grace. Do not thank me. Gratitude creates debt, and I do not deal in debt. I deal in alignment. Your interests and mine point in the same direction tonight. That is enough. She turned and walked back toward the glass doors. Behind her, Tomlin sat on the bench with snow collecting on his shoulders and an envelope in his hands and the dawning, terrifying realization that the woman everyone in the palace dismissed as a decorative ghost had just recruited him into something that could bring down the most powerful people in the kingdom. Evelina stepped back into the warmth and noise of the ballroom. The heat hit her face like a slap. The smell of perfume and wine and melting candle wax wrapped around her like a second gown. She moved through the crowd, invisible again, the mask back on her face, the composure back in her posture, the architecture of obedience reassembled so seamlessly that not a single person in the room registered that she had been gone. She found her usual spot near the third column. She stood. She watched. And across the ballroom, through a gap in the crowd that opened and closed like a breathing thing, she saw Cedric pull Seraphine onto the dance floor. He held her the way he had never held Evelina. One hand on her waist, the other clasping her fingers, his body angled toward hers with a gravity that was not choreographed but chemical. They moved through the waltz with the ease of people who had practiced being close to each other in rooms full of witnesses. Seraphine's crimson gown flared as she turned. The ruby at her throat caught the light. Cedric leaned down and whispered something in her ear, and she laughed. Not the bell-like performance from earlier, but something real, something private, a sound that had no business being made in public. The room pretended not to notice. The room always pretended. Evelina watched for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned, walked to the refreshment table, picked up a glass of champagne, and drank it in one long, steady swallow. Careful, Margot appeared beside her. You never drink at these things. Tonight is different. Clearly. Did you speak with Tomlin? Yes. And? Evelina set the empty glass down. Her eyes moved across the ballroom, past the dancing couples, past the drunk lords, past the generals and ministers and their decorative wives, and settled on the far wall, where a portrait of the first Duke of Ashcombe hung in a frame so heavy it had required 6 men to mount it. The first Duke had a face like a fist. He had built this palace with money taken from people who could not fight back, and he had called it legacy. Every Ashcombe since had done the same, they just used different words. Margot, Evelina said quietly, if I told you that I was going to do something that could destroy everything, my marriage, my title, my safety, would you tell me to stop? Margot looked at her, really looked, the way she used to look at her before 14 years of helplessness had made looking feel like watching someone drown in slow motion. No, she said. I would ask you what took so long. The corner of Evelina's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something sharper. Something with teeth. Then stay close, she said, because what happens next is going to burn. The winter masquerade ended at 3 a.m. The guests filed out in waves, the sober ones first, then the drunk ones, then the ones who had fallen asleep in corners and needed to be carried to their carriages by servants who would not be thanked. The snow outside had stopped falling. The sky was black and clear and full of stars that looked, from a distance, like they were watching. Cedric returned to the master chambers of Blackthorn Palace alone. He had said goodnight to Seraphine at the door to the east wing, a brief touch of his hand against hers, a look that said everything and nothing, and walked the long corridor to his rooms with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who owned every stone beneath his feet. He entered the chamber and found Evelina sitting in the chair by the fireplace. This was unusual. They had not shared a bedchamber in 4 years. The arrangement was unspoken, but absolute. She occupied the west wing, he occupied the master suite, and the hallway between them might as well have been an ocean. Evelina. He said her name the way someone says the name of a street they used to live on. Familiar, distant, irrelevant to their current location. Sit down, Cedric. He did not sit down. He removed his coat. He placed it on the back of the desk chair. He poured himself a glass of water from the crystal decanter on the nightstand. He did all of these things slowly, methodically, because control was not something Cedric Ashcombe performed. It was something he inhabited. It is 3 in the morning, he said. If this is about the ball, it is about Seraphine. I do not have the energy for this conversation. Then find it. The words landed differently than he expected. There was no tremor in them, no plea, no wounded wife seeking reassurance or confrontation or any of the emotional transactions that he had catalogued and dismissed over the years. There was something structural in her voice, load-bearing. He turned and looked at her. She was still in the blue gown. The silver mask sat on the armrest of the chair like a discarded face. Her hair, dark and streaked with the first threads of silver, had come partially undone, and it fell around her shoulders in a way that made her look both older and younger than she was. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. Her eyes held his without effort. Say what you need to say, he said. Your mistress is stealing from you. Silence. Seraphine she is funneling money from the reserve treasury through the northern tariff adjustments. She is using Lord Varen as a proxy. She has documents with foreign seals that she brings to private meetings and never leaves behind. She has been doing this for at least 3 months, possibly longer. Cedric stood very still. The water glass in his hand did not move. His face did not change. But something behind his eyes, something deep and old and armored, registered an impact. Where did you hear this? His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. I did not hear it. I found it. The way I have found everything else in this marriage, by paying attention while you assumed I had nothing to pay attention with. You are making accusations against a woman who has spent 3 years dismantling your authority while you were too busy admiring her to notice. I am not guessing, Cedric. I have letters. I have records. I have testimonies from people inside this court who are terrified of what she is building and more terrified of what happens when you find out. Then show me. No. The word stopped him. In 14 years of marriage, Evelina had never refused him anything. Not his indifference, not his cruelty, not his absence. She had absorbed every blow, visible and invisible, with the silent compliance that he had interpreted as weakness and she had cultivated as strategy. No, he repeated, not yet. Not until I have everything. And when I do, Cedric, I will not bring it to you in this bedroom at 3 in the morning. I will bring it to a place where it matters, where it cannot be buried or dismissed or explained away by a woman who has learned exactly which parts of your ego to stroke to make you blind. You are overstepping. I am 14 years past overstepping. I have been silent. I have been obedient. I have stood in rooms while you touched another woman's face and smiled at crowds that pitied me and played the role of the good Duchess so convincingly that even I forgot I was acting. But I am done, Cedric. Not done with you. Done with the version of me that let this happen. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. A hairline fracture in the facade that sealed itself almost instantly, like water freezing over a break in ice. Cedric stared at her. And in that moment, brief, involuntary, immediately suppressed, he felt something he had not felt toward his wife in over a decade. He felt uncertain. Go to bed, Evelina, he said. His voice was flat, controlled. A door closing. She stood. She picked up her mask. She walked past him toward the door, close enough that he could smell the champagne and the winter air still clinging to her cloak. She stopped at the threshold. Cedric. What? When this is over, and it will be over, sooner than you think, you are going to have to choose between the woman who tells you what you want to hear and the woman who is trying to save your life. She left. The door closed behind her with a sound so quiet it might as well have been a gunshot. Cedric stood alone in the master chamber of Blackthorn Palace. The fire in the hearth popped and shifted. The crystal decanter caught the light and threw small rainbows across the ceiling. Outside, the stars continued their indifferent observation of a world that believed its structures were permanent. He set the water glass down. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered gardens, where the hedges stood like soldiers frozen mid-March, and the fountain at the center of the courtyard held a thin sheet of ice that would crack by morning. He thought about what Evelina had said. He thought about foreign seals and reserve accounts, and a woman in a crimson gown who kept documents in a locked drawer and never ever left anything behind. And for the first time in 14 years, Duke Cedric Ashcombe could not tell whether the feeling in his chest was anger, fear, or the sound of something he had built beginning to collapse. 3 floors below, in the east wing of the palace, Lady Seraphine Vale sat at her writing desk, a single candle burning beside her, and unsealed a letter that had arrived by private courier during the masquerade. The wax seal was black. The crest was not from this kingdom. She read the letter twice. Then she held it over the candle flame and watched it curl and blacken and disappear. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside, beneath a stack of signed documents bearing the Duke's own hand, lay a second set of papers. Different seals, different names. A map of the kingdom's military outposts with handwritten annotations in a language that no one at the Ashcombe court could read. Seraphine closed the drawer. She locked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath the ruby pendant that Cedric had given her on their first anniversary together. An anniversary that his wife did not know about, in a relationship that his wife was never supposed to understand. She blew out the candle, and in the darkness of Blackthorn Palace, 3 people lay awake in 3 separate rooms, each one holding a piece of a truth that, when assembled, would detonate everything they had ever known. The Duke, who believed his power was unshakable. The Duchess, who had just learned it was not. And the Mistress, who was counting the days until none of it would matter, because by the time they understood what she had done, she would already be gone. The morning after the winter masquerade arrived, the way all mornings arrive after catastrophic nights, indifferent, relentlessly bright, stripping the darkness of every shadow it had used for cover. Frost crept across the palace windows in fractal patterns, and the servants moved through the corridors like people who had learned to make themselves invisible by making themselves useful. Cedric did not sleep. He sat at his desk until dawn, with the fire burning low and a glass of wine he never drank, and the name Seraphine had given him over 3 years cycling through his mind like inventory. Varen, Harwick, Draven, the Northern Tariff, the reserve accounts, documents with foreign seals. He turned each piece over the way a man turns over a stone he found in his own garden, half hoping the thing underneath is nothing, half knowing it is not. By the time gray light broke through the frost on the glass, he had arrived at a conclusion that cost him something to reach. Evelina was not hysterical. She was not jealous. She was not performing the wounded wife routine that he had learned to dismiss in the first year of their marriage. She had been specific. She had been cold. She had said the word testimonies with the precision of someone who had already cataloged them. He did not trust her, but he trusted the quality of her delivery, and the delivery had been flawless. He sent for his private secretary before breakfast. The secretary, a man named Corwin, who had served the Ashcombe family for 22 years and had long ago traded surprise for competence, appeared in the study within 12 minutes. "I need the full record of Lord Varen's council attendance for the past 6 months," Cedric said. "Every meeting, every vote, cross-reference with the Northern Tariff Amendment hearings," Corwin wrote. He did not ask why. "I also need a list of every courier delivery made to the East Wing in the past 90 days, not the official records, the actual deliveries. Talk to the stable master." "The East Wing, Your Grace. You mean—" "I know what I mean." Corwin nodded and left without another word. Cedric sat back. The fire had died to coals. The room smelled of ash and old decisions. The thing that lived between his ribs, the thing he called strategic awareness and other people would have called fear, had sharpened overnight into something he recognized from the battlefield. Not panic, orientation. The specific cold clarity that arrives when a man understands that the ground beneath him has been shifting for a long time, and only now has he felt the tremble. He thought about the letter of Seraphine's face when she warned him about Evelina. The way she said your wife looked at you differently. He had dismissed it. He dismissed most things Seraphine said about Evelina because Seraphine's interest in Evelina's emotional state had always read as competitive instinct rather than genuine intelligence. He was beginning to revise that assessment. Across the palace, in the west wing, Evelina was already dressed. She had slept 3 hours. Not because she was rested, but because 3 hours was the minimum required to keep her hands from shaking, and she needed her hands steady today. She sat at her writing desk and worked through the letters that had accumulated during the masquerade. Household accounts, estate correspondence, a request from a village elder in the northern provinces about a road that needed repair. She answered each one, not because these things were urgent, but because maintaining the rhythm of her visible life was the most important discipline she had. The frame still had to hold the picture, right up until the moment it didn't. Margot arrived at 8. She came through the servants' entrance, which they had used for private meetings for so long that the hinges had been oiled specially to keep them silent. She carried 2 cups of black tea and the expression of a woman who had been awake thinking. "Tomlin sent a message," she said, setting the tea down. Evelina looked up. "He has access to Varen's correspondence diary. 3 meetings with Seraphine in the past month, one scheduled for this Thursday." Thursday, Evelina calculated. 4 days. "Does he know the location?" "Varen's private office in the council chambers. Not his official one. The second one. The one that doesn't appear on the public schedule." "A room that doesn't officially exist," Evelina said quietly, "for meetings that don't officially happen." "Evelina, whatever you are planning, I need you to contact Lord Fenwick." Margot stopped. "The royal auditor?" "His nephew. The one who was passed over for the Treasury Council appointment last spring. His name is Aldous. He works in the archive division now. He hates Varen. He will understand what he is looking at when I show him the copies." "You don't have the copies yet." "I will by Thursday evening." Evelina picked up her tea. It was too hot to drink, but she held it anyway, using the warmth as something to anchor her hands. "I need Aldous to verify the documents before I move. I cannot bring unverified copies to the King's Council and survive the aftermath. Everything has to be ironclad, every record, every signature, every seal cross-referenced against the Foreign Trade Registry. And if the seals don't match anything in the Foreign Registry, then we know they are not trade seals." She set the cup down. "And we know what that means." Margot sat down across from her. Outside the window, the palace grounds were white and still, the snow unmarked except for the tracks of servants moving between the outbuildings. The world looked clean from here. It always looked cleanest from a distance. "How long have you been building this?" Margot asked. "The evidence?" 3 months, seriously." Evelina paused. "But the watching, the paying attention, the storing things away." She looked at her hands. 14 years. Margot said nothing for a moment, the kind of nothing that is not absence but wait. "He does not deserve you," she said finally. "I am not doing this for him." "I know, that is what I mean. In the East Wing, Seraphine woke at 7 and spent the first 20 minutes of consciousness absolutely still, processing the landscape of the previous night. The way a general processes the aftermath of a battle. What moved, what didn't, where the lines held and where they shifted. Evelina had confronted Cedric. She did not know what was said. Seraphine had her sources in the master suite's corridor, but the door had been closed and voices had been low. But she knew the confrontation had happened because the Duchess had not returned to the West Wing until after 3, and the master suite's light had burned until dawn. This was new. Evelina moving at night was new. Evelina doing anything that required initiative was new, and the newness of it had the specific quality of a variable being introduced into a system that had functioned on predictability. She dressed carefully. The crimson was for performance. Today called for something different. Gray wool, high collar, no jewelry except the pendant with the key. She needed to look like a woman attending to business, not displaying a conquest. She needed to understand what Evelina knew. The most direct method was the most dangerous. She could not approach the Duchess directly. Not here, not after last night, not when Cedric was already sleeping with uncertainty in his chest. She needed an intermediary, someone who had access to both wings of the palace without triggering notice. She thought for 90 seconds. Then she sent a note to Lady Penwick, who was Evelina's occasional companion at afternoon teas, and who owed Seraphine a favor from 2 seasons ago involving a letter and a husband who traveled frequently. Lady Penwick would not know she was being used as a probe. She would simply attend her tea and report, without realizing she was reporting, on whether the Duchess seemed agitated, distracted, or altered in any way that deviated from her established baseline of controlled sorrow. Seraphine did not underestimate Evelina. That was something she had decided early, not out of generosity, but out of self-preservation. Underestimating the people closest to your target was how operations collapsed. Evelina Ashcombe was not powerful. She was not connected. She had no title of her own, no allies of political weight, no leverage that Seraphine had ever been able to identify. But she had been watching for 14 years. And watching, in the right hands, was a form of weapon that did not announce itself until the wound was already open. The Thursday meeting with Varen needed to be moved. She drafted a new note. 2 floors down and 30 meters to the east, Lord Varen received a message at his breakfast table that made his coffee go cold. He read it twice, then folded it with the careful movements of a man who has learned that paper left unattended becomes evidence. Lady Vale was rescheduling. New location. Not the council chambers. Her private salon in the city residence. The following Monday. His stomach tightened. Changing locations meant she was uncertain about the original one. And uncertainty in Seraphine Vale was not an emotion. It was a signal. She was not uncertain. She was recalibrating. I was 49 years old. He had survived 4 royal administrations, 2 succession disputes, and 1 tax rebellion that had taken 3 of his colleagues' heads and left his own attached only because he had been too indispensable to execute. He had not survived all of that by ignoring signals. He sent a message to his secretary canceling Thursday. In the archive division of the Eastern Administrative Building, Tomlin sat at a desk surrounded by ledgers and dust and the profound anonymity of a man who processes paper for people who never read his name. He received Margot's message at midday, tucked inside a delivery of standard correspondence. He read it 3 times. Then he burned the paper in the small iron stove beside his desk, which was standard procedure for sensitive correspondence, and which no one ever questioned because everyone in the archive division burned things. Thursday was canceled. That meant the access window was gone. He sat with this for 4 minutes, which was the amount of time he could afford to sit still before someone noticed. Then he opened Varen's schedule, which he maintained as part of his secretarial duties, and identified the next private meeting. Monday, city residence. That was outside the palace. Outside the palace meant outside the standard security structure, which meant different servants, different records, different chains of oversight. It also meant Tomlin would need a reason to be present that did not require Varen's explicit authorization. He had one. Varen's city residence required the weekly delivery of council correspondence on Monday mornings. Tomlin always handled it. It was routine, invisible. He wrote a single line on a scrap of paper. New location. Monday morning. City residence. Same deal. He folded it inside a routine expense record addressed to Lady Duval's household account, which was a billing address on file in the archive system, and therefore unremarkable to anyone processing outgoing mail. Then he went back to work, and his hands were only shaking a little. The 4 days between the masquerade and Monday were a kind of warfare conducted entirely in the negative space of normal life. Cedric met with Corwin twice. The records Corwin produced were incomplete, gaps in the courier logs that should not have existed, meeting notations in Varen's attendance record that used a shorthand Corwin could not decode. These were not accidents. Gaps in records do not appear by accident. They appear because someone with access to the records understood, in advance, which absences would be hardest to explain. Cedric sat with this knowledge for 2 days before he acted on it. On Saturday morning, he called Lord Varen to the study. Varen arrived in the careful posture of a man who has been summoned and has spent the carriage ride preparing his face. He was dressed formally, too formally for a private Saturday meeting, which told Cedric that the formality was armor. "Sit down, Aldrich." Varen sat. Cedric remained standing. He stood at the window with his back to the room, watching the snow melt in slow drips from the garden hedges. He let the silence run for 20 seconds, long enough to be a choice. "The Northern Tariff Amendment," he said. "Walk me through the revenue projections." A beat. "The figures were presented to the full council, Your Grace." "Minister Hale, I did not ask about the council presentation. I asked you to walk me through them, personally, now." Varen's breathing shifted. Not much. Barely perceptible. But Cedric had spent decades in rooms with men under pressure, and pressure had a specific signature in the body, a slight elevation in the chest, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a pause before language that should have been automatic. "The base projection assumes a 12% increase in tariff revenue from the northern trade routes," Varen said. "The amendment redirects 6% of that increase to infrastructure development. The remaining 6% goes to the reserve fund." "Yes." "Which reserve fund specifically?" Another beat. Barely there. Gone almost before it arrived. "The military infrastructure reserve, standard procedure for..." Who proposed the specific language of the amendment, the redirection provision? Whose drafting was that? Silence. Cedric turned around. He looked at Varen. He looked at him the way he had looked at adversaries on the battlefield. Not with hostility, but with the particular quality of attention that strips the performance from a man and reads what is underneath it. Varen was not a traitor. Cedric did not believe that. Varen was a coward, which was different, a man who could be moved by pressure and the promise of shelter. Someone had found the cracks in him and pressed in, and the resulting fracture had been dressed up as a policy amendment. It was a collaborative process, Varen said. The council, who proposed the language, Aldrich. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Varen looked down at the floor and said something that was nearly inaudible. Cedric said, louder. Lady Vale. The name hit the air between them like a stone dropping into deep water. Lady Vale suggested the specific language. She presented it as, she said it was consistent with the Duke's broader economic strategy. I had no reason to question. Did she show you any documents? External documents, not ours. Varen's jaw tightened. He was deciding something. Cedric could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of one risk against another, the assessment of which threat was more immediate, which ceiling would fall faster. There were letters, Varen said. She presented them as background material, trade correspondence. I did not study them closely. You signed a policy amendment based on documents you did not study closely. She said they were your documents, that you had authorized. I authorized nothing. Cedric's voice did not rise. It descended. It went so quiet that the space between his words became something physical. You have one opportunity to be honest with me, Aldrich. 1. After that, I stop asking questions and start making decisions without your input. Varen looked up. His face had the expression of a man standing on ice that has just cracked. The letters had foreign seals, he said. I noticed it. I asked her. She said they were from trade representatives in the eastern provinces. She was very specific, very convincing. She always is. Your Grace, I want you to understand that I did not know what. I know what you did not know. I am more interested in what you did. Cedric moved from the window to the desk. He sat down. He picked up a quill and turned it between his fingers. You're going to write down everything, every meeting, every document you saw, every piece of language she drafted, every suggestion she made about council procedure or treasury access. All of it, today. If she finds out, she will not find out today, and by the time today matters, she will have other problems. Varen stared at him. Then he reached for the blank parchment on the desk and began to write. While Varen wrote and Seraphine waited, and the Monday meeting crept closer through the frozen days like a tide that could not be stopped, Evelina spent Sunday evening in her study making a list. Not a list of evidence, not a list of accusations, a list of consequences. She wrote it in the plain, factual language she used for estate accounts, the same voice she used to calculate the cost of roof repairs and the price of winter grain. She listed what would happen to her if the gamble failed. She listed what would happen to her title, her residence, her household staff, her access to her own finances. She listed the names of the people who would lose their positions if Cedric chose to respond to her exposure of Seraphine by punishing the people who helped her. She listed Tomlin's mother. She sat with the list for a long time. The candle burned down. The palace settled around her in its nocturnal contractions. The distant sound of guards changing at the gate. The creak of old stone cooling in the winter air. The specific silence of a building that contains too many secrets and has learned to breathe around them. She did not destroy the list. She folded it and placed it in the locked box beneath the false bottom of her writing desk, with all the other pieces of evidence she had spent 14 years collecting. Then she closed the box, turned the key, and held the key in her closed fist for exactly 10 seconds. Then she let go. Because the inventory of consequences did not change the decision. She had already made the decision 3 months ago, the night she stood in the archive corridor and watched a royal courier hand an unmarked envelope to Seraphine's private maid and saw the maid take it to the east wing and slip it under the door rather than leaving it with the standard household post. A small thing. A thing a duchess with more dignity than attention would have ignored. But Evelina had long ago traded dignity for information, and the trade had turned out to be the best deal she ever made in a marriage full of terrible deals. The envelope had foreign script on the inside corner of the seal. She had not understood it at the time. She had drawn a copy of the script from memory and sent it, through Margot, to a language scholar in the university district under the pretense of a translation project. The scholar had responded in 3 days. The script was from the Northern Frontier Territories, a region that had been in active border dispute with the kingdom for 6 years. A region whose interests, if properly exploited, would benefit enormously from detailed knowledge of the kingdom's military outpost locations and reserve fund structures. She had held that information for 3 months. She had held it the way you hold a stone before you throw it, not with anger, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone who understands that aim is everything, and that throwing early is the same as throwing wrong. Monday morning arrived cold and absolute. Tomlin delivered correspondence to Varen's city residence at 8. He was admitted through the service entrance by a housekeeper who had seen him every week for 2 years and registered his presence, the way you register a recurring weather pattern, automatically, without interest. He spent 11 minutes in the document room. He made copies of 3 pages that Lady Seraphine had brought in a leather case and left on the desk while she stepped out to receive a separate visitor. 11 minutes. The same amount of time Seraphine had spent talking to Varen at the masquerade. The same amount of time Cedric had once described as negotiating rather than speaking. Tomlin's hands shook the entire time. He did not stop. He left the copies in the archive desk in the palace east wing by 10. By noon, they were in Evelina's study. By 2 in the afternoon, they were in front of Aldous Fenwick, the rejected Treasury Council appointee, who now worked in the archive division, and who looked at the foreign seals for 30 seconds before his face went completely pale. "These are not trade seals," he said. "I know. These are correspondence seals, the kind used by—" He stopped. He looked up at Evelina. His eyes were doing the arithmetic. "These are used by foreign intelligence networks, specifically from the Northern Frontier Administration." "I know." "Duchess, do you understand what this means? These documents represent— This is not embezzlement. This is not theft. This is active cooperation with a foreign power that has been at war with this kingdom's territorial interests for 6 years," Evelina said. "Yes, I understand exactly what it means." Aldous set the papers down. He pressed both palms flat against the desk surface as if he needed to feel something solid. "If you bring this to the King's Council without ironclad corroboration, she will deny it. She will say they are forgeries. She will say you fabricated—" "I have the originals," Evelina said. Aldous went still. "Not these copies. The original letters. From the first delivery 3 months ago. I have the envelope with the seal intact, the letter inside, and a signed statement from the language scholar who translated the script." "How did you—" "Seraphine is very careful. She burns everything she can reach." Evelina reached into the inside pocket of her coat and placed a second, smaller envelope on the desk. "But she cannot burn what she does not know exists. The first letter was the mistake, the one that arrived before she understood how carefully someone else was watching." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city moved through its Monday afternoon business. Carts on cobblestones, vendors calling, the mundane percussion of a world that did not yet know what was sitting in a second-floor study 3 streets from the palace. Aldous looked at the small envelope. He did not touch it. "This will destroy her," he said. "Yes. It will destroy everyone connected to her. Several of them, yes. Including the Duke. If it comes out that his mistress, that he gave her access, the political exposure alone." "Cedric is not the target," Evelina said. Aldous looked up sharply. "He is negligent. He is proud and blind, and he has given his authority to someone who used it for treason because he was too arrogant to imagine that the woman he controlled could be controlling him. That is a failure. It is not the crime." She picked up the small envelope and held it in her hand. "The crime is Seraphine's, and it will be prosecuted as Seraphine's." "And you? What do you get from this, Duchess, if you do not take the Duke down with her?" Evelina looked at him. Her eyes were steady and dark and entirely without sentimentality. "I get to be the only person who saved this house," she said. "And that is something no one can take away from me. Not him, not her, not the council or the court or the kingdom." She stood. She placed the small envelope back in her pocket. She picked up Tomlin's copies and tucked them inside the leather document case she had brought. "I need a verified written assessment from you. Nothing official yet. Just your professional reading of the seals and the document structure. Signed, dated, in your own hand. If I sign this and it goes badly, it will not go badly. Not for you. I give you my word." Aldous stared at her. He was a man who had spent his career watching promises get made and broken in rooms like this one, by people with more power than conscience. He knew the texture of a political transaction. He had absorbed enough of them to recognize when he was inside one, but there was something in this woman's voice that did not have the smooth surface of a transaction. It had friction, the honest kind, the kind that comes from a person who has said the words, "I give you my word," and actually felt the weight of them. He picked up his pen. Evelina was back in the palace by 4. She walked through the main entrance, greeted 2 ladies in waiting by name, confirmed a dinner arrangement with the household steward, and moved through the corridor toward the west wing with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Behind her, in the east wing, Seraphine returned from the city residence at 4:30 and went directly to her writing desk. She opened the leather case. The 3 documents were still inside, still in order. She did not notice, because she had not counted them when she left and therefore had no number to compare to, that what was in the case was not the same as what had left with her that morning. The placement was identical. The texture of the paper was identical. Tomlin had been very careful. Seraphine locked the drawer. She moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard where the last of the Monday daylight was dying against the stone walls, and the shadows were extending toward the palace foundations, like fingers feeling for a purchase. Something was wrong. She could not name it. It had no face, no evidence, no specific substance. But she had survived everything she had survived by listening to the thing that did not announce itself. And right now that thing was making noise in the cavity of her chest, like a sound that lived below hearing. She turned from the window. She pulled the key from beneath the ruby pendant. She unlocked the drawer. She took out the 3 documents and laid them on the desk and studied each one, line by line, seal by seal, word by word. They were perfect. They were exactly as she had left them. They were, in every visible way, original and untouched. She sat there for a long time. The candle she lit against the failing light threw shadows that moved when the flame moved, and the shadows of the documents on the desk looked, in the unsteady light, like things that might be different than they appeared. She packed the documents back into the leather case. She locked the drawer. She stood and walked to the fireplace and stood with her back to the fire, warming her hands, looking at the room. Then she made a decision that was either the right one or the one that would finish everything. She sat back down at the desk and wrote a letter. It was short, 4 sentences. When she finished, she sealed it with the black wax and the foreign crest and held it in both hands for a moment. Not sentimentally, but with the focused attention of a chess player committing to a move that cannot be recalled. She rang for her private maid. "This goes tonight," she said. "Same route as before." The maid curtsied and left. Seraphine sat alone in the candle-lit room. She looked at the locked drawer. She looked at the fire. She looked at her own hands, which were steady and competent and gave nothing away. Then she looked at the door. And in the corridor beyond it, 14 feet of stone wall and oak, and silence between them, Evelina stood with her ear close to the seam of the doorframe and listened to the footsteps of Seraphine's private maid moving quickly toward the servants' entrance. She did not follow. She did not need to. She already knew the route, and she had already sent someone ahead. The person Evelina had sent ahead was a woman named Dara, not a servant, not a courier, a woman who had grown up in the same eastern province as Evelina, the daughter of a cloth merchant who had gone bankrupt when the northern tariff reforms of 6 years ago eliminated his trade margin overnight. Dara had come to the palace at 22 looking for laundry work, and had stayed because Evelina, who remembered what it felt like to be a woman in a building that did not see her, had offered her something better than laundry. She had offered her purpose, the kind that does not appear in any official record and pays in a currency that cannot be taxed. Dara knew the servant routes of the city the way a cartographer knows a coastline, not from maps, but from having walked every inch of it in weather that did not care whether she was comfortable. She knew which alleys connected to which back gates. She knew which houses used which courier services. She knew, specifically, that Seraphine's private maid used a route through the textile district that passed a particular tavern where the lantern above the door was never lit, and where the man who received foreign correspondence for redistribution kept a room on the second floor and never answered his door before midnight. Dara did not intercept the letter. Interception was evidence of interception, and Evelina had been very clear. Nothing that could be traced back, nothing that could be framed as interference, nothing that gave Seraphine the narrative of a persecuted woman being hunted by a jealous wife. Dara watched. She noted the time, the address, the face of the man who opened the door on the second floor, and took the sealed envelope from the maid's hand without a word. She noted the symbol above his doorframe, small, carved into the wood, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. She had seen the symbol before. 3 months ago, Evelina had shown her a sketch of it and told her to remember it. It was the administrative mark of the northern frontier territories. By the time Dara returned to the palace and slipped her report under the West Wing study door, it was nearly midnight. Evelina was still awake. She read the note by candlelight, sitting in the chair by the window with her legs tucked under her and her face absolutely still. The address. The symbol. The time. She sat with it for a long time. Not processing. She had already processed every possibility 3 months ago when she first began to understand the scale of what Seraphine was doing. What she was doing now was something harder and quieter. She was accepting the weight of it, the specific gravity of holding information that could end careers, rearrange the court's power structure, and expose a conspiracy that had been running for years inside the walls of the most protected building in the kingdom. And none of it would matter at all if she moved too soon. She folded Dara's note and burned it in the candle flame. Then she went to bed, and she slept, because she was going to need everything she had for what was coming, and exhaustion was a luxury she could no longer afford to indulge. Cedric received Varen's written testimony at 9 the following morning. 12 pages. The handwriting was cramped and uneven in the way of a man writing under duress, the letters pressing too hard into the parchment as if the weight of confession required physical force to release. Cedric read it at his desk with the door locked, and Corwin posted outside with instructions to admit no one. He read it twice. Then he sat for a very long time without moving. The testimony was comprehensive in a way that suggested Varen had been waiting for someone to ask. Every meeting, every document, every suggestion Seraphine had made about council procedure, about treasury access, about which ministers were susceptible to persuasion and which would require a different kind of pressure. It was the detailed account of a man who had been used as a vehicle for someone else's operation, and who had told himself, month after month, that the comfort of her certainty was the same as authorization. The foreign seals. Varen described them carefully. The design, the color of the wax, the specific lettering that he had, like a fool, accepted as trade correspondence from the eastern provinces. He had not been suspicious because Seraphine had presented everything with Cedric's implied authority, writing behind it like a guarantee. Cedric set the testimony down. He had built his entire life on the premise that power was synonymous with control, that the people he chose to elevate understood the nature of the transaction. They rose because he permitted it. They acted within the boundaries he set, and the authority they wielded was borrowed from his name and could be recalled at any moment. It was not a generous arrangement. He had never pretended otherwise, but it was a clear one. He had believed clarity was the same as security. Understood, reading 12 pages of Varen's cramped confession, that this was the most expensive mistake of his life. Not the cruelty, not the years of public humiliation he had engineered for his wife. Those had been moral failures, and moral failures in men of his station were practically institutional. But this, the assumption that the person he had placed inside his court, inside his decisions, inside the architecture of his power, was operating solely in service of his interests. This was the structural failure, the kind that does not announce itself until the foundation is already compromised. He had not been betrayed. He had been robbed. Slowly, methodically, by someone who had learned the exact shape of his blind spots and built a door in each one. He picked up the testimony again and turned to page 7, where Varen described a specific meeting in which Seraphine had asked him to authorize a transfer from the military infrastructure reserve to what she described as a discretionary development fund. A fund that, as far as Corwin's records could establish, did not appear in any official treasury ledger. Cedric's jaw tightened. The muscle near his ear flexed once, twice, then went still. He sent for Corwin. "I need the military infrastructure reserve accounts for the past 18 months, he said. Full ledger. Every transaction. I need to know the current balance versus the projected balance, and I need to know where the discrepancy is." Corwin did not ask why. He had long since learned that the Duke's questions contained their own context, and that the context was never good. While Corwin went to the Treasury office, Cedric made another decision, one that was harder, one that required him to set aside the pride that had been his operating system for 41 years and do something he had not done voluntarily in over a decade. He sent a note to the West Wing. Evelina received it at 11. She read it standing in the doorway of her study, still in her morning coat, with Margot watching her face for information. It said, "Come to the study, alone, now." She gave the note to Margot without comment. Margot read it and looked up with an expression that was trying not to be alarmed. "Well," Margot said. "Yes," Evelina said. Do you know what he wants? I have a reasonable hypothesis. Are you going? Evelina was already moving toward the corridor. The walk from the West Wing to the master study was 3 minutes at a normal pace. Evelina covered it in 4 because she used the extra minute to walk past the East Wing corridor and listen for the sounds of Seraphine's morning routine. The maid's footsteps, the particular sequence of a woman who ran her daily life with military punctuality. The sounds were there, normal, undisturbed. Seraphine did not know yet. Whatever Cedric was doing, he had not told her. That was either very good or the beginning of something Evelina had not planned for. She knocked twice and entered. Cedric was standing at the window. He turned when she came in and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in so many years that she almost did not recognize it. It was not softness. Cedric did not do softness. It was the specific expression of a man who has just looked at something true and cannot unsee it. Sit down, he said. I prefer to stand. A beat. He nodded once, accepting this. Varen gave me a written account, he said, of his meetings with Seraphine, the documents, the treasury transfers. I know about the transfers. How much do you know? Enough. She looked at him steadily. The military infrastructure reserve has been drawn down over 14 months. The money was moved in small enough increments that the quarterly reports would not flag the variance. The total discrepancy, based on what I have been able to reconstruct from the secondary records, is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 in gold equivalent. The number hit him. She saw it land. His chest contracted once, and then the control came back down like a visor closing. And the foreign correspondence, he said. One confirmed letter with a Northern Frontier Intelligence seal. One address in the textile district that serves as the redistribution point. One man I have not yet identified who handles incoming and outgoing material. Cedric stared at her. You have been running an investigation. Yes. Inside my palace. Inside my home, she said, quietly, without heat, as a simple correction of fact. I have lived here for 14 years, Cedric. It has always been my home. I simply stopped pretending it was yours. The silence between them had a texture, not hostile. Something more complicated, the specific weight of two people who have been in the same room for years and are only now, in the worst possible circumstances, actually seeing each other. Why did you not come to me when you first found the letter? He asked. Because you would not have believed me, and because I did not have enough yet to make not believing me impossible. You thought I would protect her. I thought you would do what powerful men always do when their ego is implicated. I thought you would look at the source of the accusation instead of the accusation itself. She paused. I was not wrong to think that. He did not deny it. The not denying cost him something visible. His jaw moved, his eyes went briefly to the floor, then came back up. What else do you have? He said. Enough to take to the king's council. If you go to the council before I have contained this, you cannot contain this, Cedric. There is nothing left to contain. The money is already gone. The letters are already sent. The contacts she has built inside the court over 3 years do not disappear because you decide to be strategic about timing. She moved 2 steps closer to him, not threatening, simply refusing to let distance be his armor. This is past the point of management. The only question now is whether you control the narrative, or she does. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something old and armored and unused to moving. You said you had testimonies, he said. Plural. Varen is one. I have 2 others. Neither will stand up alone, but together with Varen's account and the physical evidence, the original letter, the copies of the documents, Aldous Fenwick's verification of the foreign seals. The pattern is clear enough that the council will have no choice. Fenwick, the name landed with a specific weight. You brought Aldous Fenwick into this. He is the most qualified person in the kingdom to verify intelligence documents. He is also someone Seraphine overlooked when she was building her network. She focused on the powerful and the corruptible. Fenwick was neither useful enough to recruit nor threatening enough to neutralize. Evelina's voice was dry. She made the same mistake you did. She did not see the people who were not performing for her. Cedric moved away from the window. He walked to the desk and placed both hands flat on the surface and stared down at the wood grain. He breathed. She watched his shoulders. She is in this building, he said. Right now, she is 40 meters from where we are standing, and she does not know that I know. No. She does not know what you know. She may suspect that something has shifted. She sent a letter last night. I believe it was a signal to her contact, either reporting a concern or requesting instructions. I do not know the content. He looked up sharply. She may be preparing to move. Possibly. If she destroys what she has here, if she burns the documents before we can, she will not burn the originals. She has not finished using them. Whatever she has planned, it is not complete yet. She does not exit an operation she has spent 3 years building because of a feeling of unease. Evelina held his gaze. She is careful. She is disciplined. She will not run until she has what she came for. And what did she come for? The question hung in the cold air of the study. Outside, the palace grounds were white and quiet, the kind of winter stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. I do not know yet, Evelina said, but I think it is bigger than the money. That evening, something broke. Corwin's treasury report landed on Cedric's desk at 4 in the afternoon. The numbers were worse than Evelina's estimate. The military infrastructure reserve had been drawn down by 73,000 in gold equivalent over 16 months. Not 14. 16. The operation had started 2 months earlier than anyone had mapped. Cedric read the report alone. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He went to find Seraphine. He did not send a note. He did not use a servant as an intermediary. He walked through the East Wing corridor himself, in the early dark of the winter afternoon, and he knocked on her door with his knuckles rather than his ring, which was the knock of a man rather than a duke. She opened the door herself. Her face moved through 3 expressions in the space of a second: surprise, recalibration, a smile that she assembled so fast it should have been convincing. It was not convincing. Not to him. Not anymore. Cedric. She stepped back. Come in. He stepped in. He looked at the room, the fireplace, the writing desk with its locked drawer, the leather case on the side table. Close the door, he said. She closed it. He turned and looked at her. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence be what it was, a tribunal without formality. The military infrastructure reserve, he said. Her face did not move. 73,000, he said, 16 months. I do not know what you do not. The word came out flat and absolute, a door slamming. Do not do that. I have Varen's written account. I have the secondary treasury records. I have the courier route and the address in the textile district and the description of the man on the second floor. The color left her face. Not dramatically, not the theatrical pallor of a caught actor, the specific physiological draining of blood from the surface when the body redirects its resources inward for survival. Cedric. How long have you been operating inside this court on behalf of foreign interests? That is not, you are mischaracterizing. How long? The silence lasted 4 seconds. Evelina had been right. Evelina was right about everything, and the understanding of that landed on him like a stone falling from a very great height, slow, and then all at once. I have been managing a relationship, Seraphine said carefully. The performance was gone. What replaced it was something harder, more stripped, the voice she used when the room had gotten too small for pretense. A relationship that benefits this house. The northern frontier interests are not enemies unless we make them enemies. The correspondence you are describing is diplomatic groundwork, the kind that does not go through official channels, because official channels are too slow and too visible. Diplomatic groundwork, Cedric repeated. Yes, that you conducted without my knowledge. I was going to bring it to you when it was what? When you had already moved 73,000 in gold to an account that does not appear in any ledger in this kingdom? The money is not gone. It is held in trust, as a demonstration of good faith to the frontier administrators. The same way embassies operate. The same way every powerful kingdom maintains back-channel relationships with border territories. She was good. He had always known she was good. But she was performing for an audience that had already read the script, and the performance had the specific hollowness of a story being told by someone who knows the listener already knows how it ends. The frontier territory, Cedric said slowly, has been in active border dispute with this kingdom for 6 years. Their administrators have been formally designated as hostile agents by the King's Council. Any correspondence with them, diplomatic, commercial, or personal, is classified as an act against the crown. Seraphine went very still. You knew this, he said. She did not answer. You knew this when you started. You knew it when you drafted the tariff amendment. You knew it when you signed documents in my name and used my authority to move money out of a military account and into the hands of people who have been trying to map our outpost positions for 6 years. I was protecting this house, she said. Her voice had changed again. The calculation was gone. What came through now was something raw, something that might have been close to genuine if he had not spent the last hour reading a 12-page document that stripped every generous interpretation from every memory he had of her. The Frontier Administration has information. If it reaches the wrong people here, if certain parties learn what has been exchanged in correspondence between this court and their agents, the damage to your name, to the Ashcombe legacy, are you threatening me? I am telling you that you need me. You are threatening me with the consequences of a situation you created. I am telling you that the situation is manageable, that it has always been manageable, that every piece of it can be contained if you stop listening to whoever has been feeding you this narrative and start, my wife. The two words stopped her. It was my wife, Cedric said, who found the letter, who built the case, who sat across from me in this palace for 3 months while you were in my bed and my counsel and my decisions, and said nothing, and waited, and gathered everything she needed to make it impossible for anyone to look away. He paused. Including me. Something moved across Seraphine's face. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific expression of a strategist realizing, for the first time, that the variable she had written off as irrelevant had been the most consequential factor in the entire operation. She does not understand what she has done, Seraphine said. If this goes to the council, if the foreign correspondence becomes part of a public proceeding, the exposure does not stop with me. It pulls in Varen. It pulls in Harwick. It pulls in every transaction I conducted under your name, and your name is attached to all of them, Cedric. Every signed document, every authorized transfer. You approved the tariff amendment. You approved the Pemberley grant. In the official record, you are not the victim of this. You are the architect. The room was completely silent. Cedric stood in the center of it. He was 41 years old, and he had built an entire life on the premise that he could not be touched. That his name, his title, his accumulated power created a barrier between himself and consequence that ordinary people could not cross. Understood now, in a single moment of cold and absolute clarity, that the barrier had been dismantled from the inside, and that the woman who had done it was standing 4 feet away from him, telling him that his only protection was her silence. Get out of this room, he said. Cedric, get out, right now. Do not go to the East Wing. Do not contact anyone. Do not touch the documents in that drawer. He held her gaze with the specific quality of attention that meant he had crossed the point where emotion was a factor. I am not asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she left. Cedric stood alone in the room. The fire cracked. The shadows moved. He looked at the locked drawer of her writing desk and thought about what was inside it, and what it meant for everything he had built. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and sent for his personal guard. He also, without examining his own reasoning too carefully, sent a second message. To the West Wing. Evelina received it at 6:30. 4 words. It has begun. Come. She was already dressed. She had been dressed for an hour, sitting in her study with the leather document case across her knees and the locked box from under the false bottom of the writing desk open on the table. Everything laid out in the order she had mentally rehearsed for 3 months. She did not rush. She picked up the case. She closed the box. She walked to Margot's door and knocked twice. Their signal. Margot opened it immediately. She was also dressed. Now? She said. Now. They moved together through the West Wing corridor toward the master's study. Behind them, the palace settled into its evening rhythms. Servants lighting lamps, guards changing at the outer posts, the mechanical dignity of a building that believed itself immovable. Ahead, in the East Wing, Seraphine stood at her window and looked out at the courtyard and understood, with the precise intelligence that had gotten her this far, that the geometry of the situation had changed, that she was no longer operating, that she was, for the first time in 3 years, being operated upon. She turned from the window. She looked at the locked drawer. She looked at the door. And she made the decision that Evelina had been waiting for her to make. The decision that would collapse the careful distance between exposure and catastrophe, and force every person in Blackthorn Palace to stop managing the crisis and start surviving it. She unlocked the drawer. She took out the documents. She opened the leather case. And she began to make copies, not to destroy, not to run. To arm herself for what she now understood was no longer a covert operation, but a war. And in a war, the only currency that mattered was information that the other side did not know you had. She worked fast. Her hands were steady. Outside, somewhere in the palace, she could hear footsteps in the corridor. Measured, deliberate, more than one person. She had maybe 10 minutes. She used every one of them. The footsteps Seraphine heard in the corridor were Evelina's, not guards, not Cedric. Evelina, moving through the east wing with Margot 3 paces behind her and the leather document case under her arm, and 14 years of patience compressed into something that no longer resembled patience at all. It resembled inevitability. The specific forward motion of a woman who has finished calculating and started acting, and who understands that the distance between those two states is the only distance that has ever mattered. She did not go to Seraphine's door, she went to Cedric's study. He was already there. Standing behind the desk, his personal guard posted at the interior door, Corwin in the corner with a ledger open across his arms, like a man holding his own evidence. The fire was high. The room was too warm. Cedric looked like a man who had been standing in the same position for an hour and had not noticed. Evelina placed the leather case on his desk without ceremony. "Everything," she said. "The original letter with the frontier seal intact. Fenwick's written verification. Varen's testimony, which I know you already have, but mine is a clean copy with a witness signature. The courier route documentation and the address in the textile district. And here," she opened the case and placed a separate, smaller envelope on top. A translation of the script from the letter's interior seal. University scholar, signed and dated. Cedric looked at the documents. He looked at her face. He said nothing for several seconds. "You have been carrying this for 3 months," he said. "Yes. Alone." Margot knew, Dara, Tomlin, Fenwick at the end. She paused. "People you have never considered significant enough to notice." The implication landed exactly where she intended it. She watched it settle into his expression and go still there, like a stone dropping through water until it hits the bottom. "What do you need from me?" he said. The question, the specific shape of it, a duke asking his wife what she needed rather than issuing an instruction, hung in the overheated air of the study with a quality that Margot, watching from the doorway, would later describe to her own diary as the sound of something very old finally breaking. "I need you to send for General Heron," Evelina said. "Not Draven. Heron. He is clean. Seraphine never approached him because she assessed him as too loyal to you to be flipped. That loyalty is our asset now. Heron commands the palace garrison. Yes. I need the garrison on quiet alert. Not visible deployment. No movement that Seraphine's contacts inside the staff will register as escalation. I need it done in the next 30 minutes. Cedric looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she had not seen there before. Not admiration. It was too raw and too complicated for admiration. It was the specific expression of a man encountering, for the first time, the full dimensions of something he had lived beside for years and never once looked at directly. He turned to Corwin. "Get Heron." Corwin left at a pace that was almost running. In the East Wing, Seraphine finished her copies in 8 minutes. She was fast because she had always been fast, and because speed was the first discipline she had taught herself in a life that had required constant recalibration. She had grown up in a household where resources were finite and competition was not a metaphor, and she had learned before she was old enough to articulate it that the person who moved first controlled the terms of everything that followed. She placed her copies in a second leather case, older, plainer, the kind of case that looked like correspondence supplies rather than an archive of evidence. She locked the original documents back in the drawer. The key went back under the ruby pendant against her sternum, warm from her skin. Then she sat down and thought for exactly 90 seconds. Her contact in the textile district had the letter she sent last night. She did not know if he had acted on it yet. The Frontier Administrative Network moved quickly when threatened and slowly when it believed it had time, and she did not know which assessment they were currently operating under. She had signaled concern, but not emergency. If they read the signal correctly, they would be preparing an exit route. If they read it wrong, they would be waiting for clarification. She could not afford to wait for their response. She stood up. She put on her traveling coat, not the dramatic crimson, not the gray wool of calculated appearances, but a dark practical coat she kept at the back of the wardrobe for the mornings she rode before the palace woke. The kind of garment that made a woman look like staff rather than nobility. The kind that let you move through a building without snagging anyone's attention. She picked up the plain leather case. She looked at the door. She understood, with the precise and unsentimental clarity that had kept her alive through situations that had destroyed other people, that she had 2 options. She could stay and fight the narrative Evelina had built, use the copies as leverage, threaten exposure of the names attached to the official documents she had signed in Cedric's name, and force a negotiation that left her with enough to walk away intact. Or she could leave. The calculation was brutal and fast. Staying required Cedric's cooperation, and Cedric's cooperation required that his pride outweigh his survival instinct, which it had always done before but which she was no longer certain it would do now. Evelina had changed the room. Whatever had been said in that study, whatever documents were on that desk, the dynamic had shifted in a direction that Seraphine had spent 3 years engineering against, and had not, apparently, sufficiently accounted for. The woman he had ignored for 14 years had turned out to be the most dangerous person in the building. Seraphine had known this was possible. She had told him, the night of the masquerade. She had said your wife looked at you differently. He had dismissed it. She should have acted on it herself instead of warning him. That was the mistake. The single, irreversible mistake in an otherwise meticulous operation. She had seen the variable, and instead of neutralizing it, she had reported it to the one person whose ego made him structurally incapable of taking it seriously. She moved to the door. In Cedric's study, General Heron arrived in 12 minutes. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a face that had been weathered by campaigns in 3 different theaters, and which now had the texture of something that had been tested enough times to stop showing the testing. He looked at the documents on the desk, at Evelina standing beside it, at Cedric's face, and processed the situation with the efficiency of a man who had spent his career making fast assessments of complex terrain. "Quiet alert," Cedric said. "Garrison on soft deployment. No external movement. I need every exit from the east wing covered without looking covered. Servants' entrance, garden gate, the passage behind the heating room that half the staff doesn't know exists." "You know about that passage?" Heron said. "My wife informed me of it approximately 4 minutes ago." Heron looked at Evelina. She held his gaze without expression. "Done," he said, and left. Cedric turned back to the desk. He picked up the Frontier Seal letter, the original, the one Evelina had held for 3 months, and looked at it with the expression of a man examining the instrument of his own wounding. "When the King's Council convenes," Evelina said, "it will need to happen before she has time to build a counter-narrative. She has copies of the documents. I am nearly certain of it. She would not have left originals as her only copies. She is too careful. If she has copies, they are weapons, not evidence. She cannot present copied documents to a tribunal without exposing herself as the person who made them. The originals are what matter, and the originals are in that drawer. How do you know she has not already moved them?" "Because the drawer was still locked when you were in that room 10 minutes ago. You told me it was locked." "She could have—" "Cedric." Her voice was even, precise, the voice she used for estate accounts and hard truths. "I need you to trust my assessment of this. Not because you owe me trust. Not because of 14 years of anything. Because I am the only person in this building who has been paying close enough attention to be right." He looked at her across the desk. The fire crackled. The shadows moved. He nodded once. The East Wing corridor was empty when Seraphine stepped into it. The lamps were lit at their evening intervals. The portraits of Ashcombe ancestors lined the walls in their heavy frames. The first Duke's iron face at the far end watching the length of the passage with the permanent contempt of a man who had taken what he wanted from the world and called it legacy. She moved toward the servants' staircase. Quiet. Fast. The plain coat. The plain case. A woman on an errand. She reached the staircase door and pushed it open. On the other side, standing with his arms at his sides, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has been given an instruction and intends to follow it precisely, was one of Heron's garrison guards. Not in full armor, not visibly armed. A servant's jacket over his uniform, standing near the wall as if he belonged there. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. "Lady Vale," he said, politely, immovably. "The Duke requests your presence in the main study." Seraphine's hands, holding the plain leather case, did not move. Her face did not change. She was calculating the geometry of the staircase, the width of the corridor, the door behind her, and the distance to the next one, and all of it was adding up to a number she did not like. "Of course," she said. She turned and walked back toward the study. The guard fell into step behind her, not close enough to be aggressive, close enough to be a fact. Inside her chest, her heart was doing something it almost never did. It was loud. She could feel it against her ribs like a fist against a door. She had 4 minutes before she reached the study. She used them. When the study door opened and Seraphine walked in with the garrison guard a step behind her, the room contained 4 people. Cedric, Evelina, Margot, and a thin, gray-haired man in a scholar's coat who Seraphine had never seen before, and who was standing near the fireplace with a document in his hands and reading glasses on his nose. Fenwick. She identified him by process of elimination, the verification scholar, the man she had not bothered to neutralize because she had not assessed him as a threat. She set the plain leather case down beside the door with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. She was not hiding that she had it. There was no longer any point. She looked at Cedric. He looked back at her. The room had the atmosphere of a courtroom that had not yet been formally convened, all the weight and none of the procedure. "Sit down, Seraphine," Cedric said. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room and looked at each person in it with the efficient attention of a strategist taking inventory of a battlefield, Fenwick with his documents. Margot near the window. Evelina beside the desk with her case open and her hands visible and her face carrying an expression that was not triumph and not satisfaction, but something more durable than either. The expression of a woman who has done an enormous amount of work and is watching it hold. "You have been thorough," Seraphine said, to Evelina, not to Cedric. "Yes," Evelina said. "The frontier seal letter, the courier route, Fenwick's verification." She was cataloging, not panicking. Her voice was level. "How long did it take you to find the textile district contact?" 3 months from the first letter." "You drew the script from memory." "I have a good memory." "Yes." Something moved across Seraphine's face. Not remorse. The specific acknowledgement of a professional recognizing a professional. "You do." "Seraphine," Cedric's voice cut across the room. "The documents in the drawer, the originals. Give me the key." The key under the ruby pendant, against her sternum, the one thing she had left. She looked at him. She had looked at him from this position, standing in a room full of people who wanted something from her, hundreds of times in 3 years. She had always been able to read the room, find the angle, locate the thing that gave her leverage, and use it before anyone realized she was using it. There was no angle here. Evelina had closed everyone. "The money," Seraphine said. "The 73,000. I can tell you exactly where it is, how to retrieve it, every account, every intermediary, every routing record, all of it." She looked at Cedric. "In exchange for consideration, a passage out, a head start. Enough time to be beyond the kingdom's reach before the council is convened." The room was very quiet. Cedric's jaw moved. The muscle near his ear flexed once. He looked at his wife. Evelina looked back at him. She did not speak. She did not nod or shake her head. She simply looked at him with the steady, unflinching attention of a woman who has placed all her chips on the table and is now watching the person across from her decide whether he is the man she has bet on or the man she has always known him to be. This was the moment, not the documents, not the evidence, not the frontier seals or the treasury records or Fenwick's verification. This moment, right here, in a study with too much fire and 4 people watching a duke decide what kind of man he was going to be at the end of everything he had built. Cedric looked at Seraphine for a long time. He looked at the pendant at her throat. He looked at the plain leather case beside the door. He looked at the woman who had spent 3 years inside his life like a hand inside a glove, animating every decision with her own agenda, while he stood at the front of the room and believed he was the one doing the moving. He thought about all the rooms he had stood in, all the people he had made small, all the decisions he had handed off to the woman who told him what he wanted to hear and called it partnership. He thought about Evelina's hands not shaking. "No," he said. Seraphine went still. "There is no deal," Cedric said. "No passage, no head start, nothing." His voice had the specific flatness of a man who has paid an enormous price to reach a decision and is not going to revisit it. "Give me the key. If you take me to the council, if the correspondence becomes part of a public proceeding, the documents I signed under your name will expose my negligence. Yes, I am aware." He moved from behind the desk and walked toward her, and every step had the quality of a man burning a bridge he had spent years building. "I am aware of exactly what it costs. Give me the key." "Cedric, I will not say it again." Seraphine looked at him. She was doing the final calculation, and he could see it happening behind her eyes. The last check of every variable, the last assessment of every exit. Her hand moved to her throat, to the pendant, to the chain beneath it, and then something happened that no one in the room had planned for. From somewhere in this east wing corridor, at a distance that was close enough to be inside the building but far enough to be muffled by stone and wood, there was a sound. Sharp, percussive. The sound of a door being struck from the outside with enough force to rattle the frame. Then voices. Multiple. The clipped, urgent vocal register of men who have discovered that what they were guarding is no longer where they left it. Heron appeared in the study doorway in under 30 seconds. His face had the tight, controlled expression of a soldier delivering information he does not want to be delivering. "The East Wing," he said. "Lady Vale's private chamber. The drawer is open. The documents are gone." The room held its breath. Seraphine's hand dropped from the pendant. Her face went through something complicated and fast and landed on an expression that was almost amused. "The copies," Evelina said. Her voice was quiet and very controlled. "She switched them before we got here. While she was making copies, she switched the originals into the plain case." Everyone looked at the plain leather case beside the door. Everyone looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked at Evelina with the specific expression of one chess player looking at another after a game that has lasted too long and gone too deep, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. They both understood what had just happened, and the understanding between them was the most honest communication that had occurred in Blackthorn Palace in 14 years. Cedric moved toward the case. Seraphine moved first, not to stop him, not to run. She moved to the fireplace, and she had the case open before anyone in the room fully processed the direction of her intention, and the first document was in the flame before Heron had crossed half the distance between the door and the hearth. "Stop her!" Evelina's voice, sharp and flat simultaneously. Heron's hands closed on Seraphine's arms. The second document was in her hand, held over the fire, the edge already catching, the frontier seal beginning to blacken and curl at the corner. "Let go," Heron said. "The moment you take this from me, it burns," Seraphine said. Her voice was completely steady. The document was in her right hand, the flame an inch from the paper, and her eyes were on Cedric across the room. "One reach. That is all it takes." The room froze. The fire popped. The document's edge smoked. The frontier seal wavered in the heat, its wax beginning to soften at the outermost ring. Cedric stood in the center of the room and understood in a moment of crystalline and terrible clarity that the decision he had refused to make all his life had just arrived in a form that would not accept deferral. He looked at the document. He looked at the fire. He looked at Seraphine's steady hand and steady eyes, and the 3 years of his own blindness standing between him and everything this paper could prove. He looked at Evelina. She was looking at him. Her face was composed. Her hands were at her sides. She was not signaling. She was not directing. She was simply present and watching. And the watching had the quality of a woman who has done everything she could do and has arrived at the single moment where the only thing left is the truth of another person's character. He took a step forward. "Burn it," he said. "Burn it," Cedric said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed it was the silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the man who had just spoken. Seraphine stared at him. The document trembled in her hand above the flame. Not from fear, but from the specific physical instability of a person whose entire operating model has just been invalidated in 4 syllables. "You cannot be serious," she said. "I am always serious." He took another step forward. His eyes stayed on her face, not the document. "Burn it. Burn all of them. Every copy you made, every original you moved. Put them all in the fire. If those documents burn, then they burn, and everything connected to them burns with them." Heron's grip on her arms had not loosened. Seraphine looked from Cedric to the fire and back, and for the first time in 3 years, she could not read the calculation. She could not find the angle. Because there was no angle. The man standing in front of her was not protecting himself. He was not managing a crisis or preserving a narrative. He was doing something she had genuinely not modeled as a possibility. He was choosing consequence over control. "You will be implicated," she said. "Without the foreign correspondence as evidence, the Council will look at the Treasury transfers and see your name on every authorization. You cannot explain. I know what I cannot explain." He was 3 feet from her now. His voice had dropped to something private and hard and stripped of every performance he had ever given in a room full of witnesses. "I signed documents I did not read. I gave authority to someone I did not question. I let my name be used as a door through which someone walked into the heart of this kingdom and took what they came for. That is true whether those documents exist or not. The only difference is whether I spend the next year fighting the documentation or standing in front of the council and saying it plainly." The document's edge was burning. The flame had consumed a 1/4 inch of the paper's corner and was moving inward with the steady patience of fire, which does not hurry because it does not need to. "Burn it, Seraphine," he said. And then give me the rest. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite recognition, and not quite grief, and not quite the cold strategic recalculation that governed everything she did. It was something in the territory between those things. The expression of a woman who spent 3 years studying a man and still, at the end, managed to miss the most essential thing about him. She let the document fall into the fire. Then she opened the plain leather case and placed each remaining document into the flames, one at a time, with the precise and deliberate movements of a woman performing a formal act. Not destruction, surrender. The specific surrender of someone who has run out of terrain and understands, for the first time, what it cost to have spent everything on an operation that ended here. When the last page was ash, she straightened. She looked at Cedric. She reached up and unclasped the ruby pendant from her neck. She held it out. He did not take it. Keep it, he said. It was a gift. Gifts do not reverse. She looked at the pendant in her palm. Then she set it on the mantelpiece with a small, definitive sound. What happens now? She said. Heron. Heron moved her toward the door with the firm, impersonal efficiency of a man executing an instruction. At the threshold, Seraphine stopped. She looked back at the room, at Fenwick with his documents, at Margot near the window, at the desk covered in evidence, at the fire still consuming the last edges of the copies she had made. Her eyes found Evelina. You won, she said. No bitterness, no performance, a simple acknowledgement of a final score. I protected my house, Evelina said. Seraphine nodded once. Then she left. The door closed. Her footsteps moved down the corridor with the measured rhythm of a woman who had not stopped being composed. Even now, even at the end of everything, because composure was the only thing she had ever truly owned. The room exhaled. Margot sat down in the chair by the window with the specific collapse of a person who has been holding themselves upright through force of will and no longer needs to. Fenwick began quietly organizing the remaining legitimate documents into a stack, his scholar's hands moving with the habitual care of someone who treats paper as sacred regardless of what it contains. Heron would deliver Seraphine to the custody of the palace garrison pending the King's Council summons. All of this would unfold in the next 12 hours with the slow, grinding machinery of institutional consequence. But right now, in this study, two people stood on opposite sides of a desk covered in evidence of the most consequential failure of both their lives. Cedric looked at Evelina. She looked back at him. The fire had settled to a low, steady burn. The ash of Seraphine's documents lay in the grate like the remains of a city. Outside, the winter night had closed fully over Blackthorn Palace, and the stars that Dara had watched from the Textile District alley 3 days ago were visible through the study window, cold and precise and entirely indifferent to the human wreckage below them. You knew I would say burn it, Cedric said. No, Evelina said. I hoped. The difference between those two words, knowing and hoping, settled between them like the difference between a wall and a door. Sit down, Cedric, she said. He sat. Not in the chair behind the desk, the chair of authority, the chair of the Duke, but in the plain chair beside the fireplace, the one the servants used when they took dictation. He sat in it without seeming to notice what it was, and the not noticing was its own kind of statement. Evelina sat across from him, the fire between them. The council, she said. Heron can request an emergency session for the day after tomorrow. Varen's testimony, Fenwick's verification, the original letter with the frontier seal. The documentation is sufficient without the copies. The copies were always secondary. She will deny everything. She will try. But 3 witnesses, plus verified physical evidence, plus a treasury discrepancy of 73,000 is not deniable in any language. She paused. And you will stand up and tell the council what you signed and when and why you did not read it. His jaw tightened. That will cost us. Yes. The Ashcombe name will survive a duke who made mistakes and admitted them. It will not survive a duke who covered them up and got caught doing it. She looked at him steadily. You know this. You knew it when you told her to burn the documents. He looked at the fire, the ash in the grate, the ruby pendant on the mantelpiece, still catching the light, still throwing small red fragments across the ceiling like something that did not know it was over. 14 years, he said. Not as an accusation, not as a plea. As a simple enumeration of time, the specific weight of years counted out and found wanting. Yes. I was not... He stopped, started again. The language was not coming easily, which told her more than fluency would have. The things I did, the way I, the public. I know what you did, she said. I was there. That is not, I'm trying to. He looked at his hands, large hands, scarred at the knuckles from a campaign in the Eastern Territories 15 years ago, before the title and the palace and the machinery of aristocracy had replaced the physical world with the political one. I'm trying to say that I understand now what it cost you, and I have no right to ask you to. I am not asking for anything. It was the most unguarded string of sentences she had ever heard from him. 6 incomplete thoughts in a row from a man who had spent his entire life refusing to begin a sentence he could not finish. The thing that lived inside Evelina's chest, the cold, patient, geological thing that had been shifting for 3 months, moved again. Not thawing, not collapsing, reconsidering its own structure. I'm not going to tell you it is forgiven, she said, because it is not. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. She looked at the fire. But I'm not leaving. Not because I have nowhere to go. Not because the title protects me. Because I chose this house. And I'm not going to abandon a house because the man I share it with turned out to be capable of being worse than I deserved and better than I expected, sometimes in the same breath. Cedric looked at her. His eyes, which she had spent 14 years watching, stay flat and controlled and impenetrable, held something that was not quite broken, but was in the vicinity of broken. The expression of a man looking at the full cost of his choices, laid out in front of him without the softening he had always been able to arrange before. What do you need from me? He said. It was the same question he had asked earlier in the evening, but it sounded different now. Earlier, it had been tactical. Now it was the question underneath the question, the one a person asks when they have stopped pretending they already know the answer. I need you to be present, she said. Not performing, not managing. Present. She let the words sit between them. In the council chamber, at the hearing, when they strip Seraphine's title and go through the names of everyone she compromised, I need you standing next to me and looking at it without flinching. And after? After is a long road. We will see what it looks like when we get there. He nodded. A small movement. The kind of nod that is not agreement but acknowledgement. Of terms, of distance, of the specific difficulty of the territory ahead. Margot rose quietly from the window chair and touched Evelina's shoulder as she passed. I will be in the West Wing, she said. Nothing else. No congratulations, no commentary, just the small declaration of continued presence that was its own form of loyalty. Fenwick gathered his documents and bowed and said something about returning in the morning for final verification, and his footsteps receded down the corridor, and then it was only the two of them, and the fire and the ash and the pendant on the mantelpiece. Cedric stood. He walked to the fireplace and picked up the pendant and held it for a moment. The ruby caught the flame. The chain pooled in his palm. He walked to the window and opened it. The winter air came in sharp and immediate, the smell of snow and stone, and the particular clarity of a night that has stopped pretending it is anything other than cold. He dropped the pendant into the courtyard below. It made no sound, or if it did, the wind took it. He closed the window. He turned around. Evelina was standing now, the leather document case under her arm, her posture carrying the same quality it always carried, straight, contained, the architecture of a woman who had learned to be her own structure. But there was something different in it tonight. Something that was not tension and not relief, but the specific quality of a person who has carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally set it down in the right place. Go to bed, he said. It came out differently than it had the night of the masquerade, when he had said it like a dismissal. Now it came out like the only useful thing he had left to offer. You too, she said. She left. He stood alone in the study for a while, looking at the desk, the documents, the empty grate. The fire was dying. He did not add wood. He let it go the way things go when you stop maintaining them. Slowly, without drama, until the light reduced itself to coals, and the coals reduced themselves to ash, and the room went cold and quiet and honest. The King's Council convened 36 hours later in the capital's formal chamber. It was not a public proceeding. That had been Evelina's specific request, delivered to Heron's office the morning after, with the directness of a woman who had stopped making requests and started issuing specifications. Not public, not a spectacle. A proceeding of record, with full documentation, conducted in front of the council members and the relevant parties and no one else. The chamber was high-ceilinged and cold, the kind of room designed to make individuals feel appropriately small in the presence of institutional judgment. 12 council members, 4 generals, including Heron, Fenwick with his verified documentation, Varen, who arrived looking like a man who had not slept since Saturday, and who sat through the entire proceeding with the expression of someone making peace with a consequence they had spent months trying to avoid. Seraphine was present in the custody of 2 palace guards. She sat at the far end of the council table and looked at each person in the room with the same precise, cataloging attention she always used, and found, in each face, the specific quality of people who have already made up their minds and are waiting for the procedure to catch up with the verdict. She did not speak during the documentation review. She did not speak when Fenwick presented his verified analysis of the frontier seal, cross-referenced against the kingdom's formal registry of foreign intelligence markers. She did not speak when Varen read his written testimony aloud, in the cramped, halting voice of a man hearing himself confess in public for the first time. She spoke once. When the council chairman asked her to confirm or deny the allegations, she looked down the length of the table at Cedric, who sat at the opposite end in the chair of the presiding noble, with his hands flat on the table and his face carrying the expression she had first seen in the study 2 nights ago. The expression of a man who has decided to stop managing the cost and start paying it. "I deny nothing," she said, "and I confirm nothing. What is in those documents is in those documents. Your interpretation of them is your business." The chairman looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his colleagues. The vote took 4 minutes. Lady Seraphine Vale was stripped of her court title. Her assets within the kingdom were seized pending full audit of the treasury discrepancy. She was given 7 days to leave the capital before formal banishment proceedings began. The frontier contact in the textile district was arrested the same afternoon by a separate garrison unit, and the network he had maintained would take the kingdom's intelligence division the better part of a year to fully map and dismantle. None of this was announced publicly. It appeared in the official record as a matter of court administration. 3 lines. The specific bureaucratic language of institutions that have learned to make catastrophe invisible. Seraphine left the chamber between her guards, without looking at anyone. At the door, she paused for a single moment, not long enough to be dramatic, not short enough to be dismissible, and then she walked through it and did not come back. The chamber settled into the specific quiet of a space from which something has just been removed. Cedric stood and addressed the council. He spoke for 11 minutes. He named every document he had signed without reading. He named every transfer he had authorized without verifying. He laid out the geography of his own negligence with the flat, deliberate honesty of a man who has decided that precision is the only form of dignity available to him now. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not offer mitigation. He finished by proposing a full independent audit of the Ashcombe estate's financial dealings for the past 3 years, to be conducted by Fenwick's office, with results presented to the full council. When he sat down, the room was very quiet. Then Heron, who was not given to unnecessary speech, said, "Noted and accepted." That was all. Outside the council chamber, in the corridor with its high windows and its thin winter light, Evelina was waiting. She was standing against the wall, which was where she always stood, not in the center of rooms, not in the position of display, but at the edge, where the view was complete and the exits were visible, and the watching could happen without interruption. She held nothing. Her hands were at her sides. She was not performing composure. She simply was composed, the way stone is composed, not because it is pretending to be solid, but because solidity is its nature. Cedric came through the chamber door and stopped when he saw her. They stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking. The winter light came through the windows at a low angle, the kind of light that does not flatter anything but shows everything accurately, and in it they looked like what they were. 2 people who had been through a war in a building where the walls were silk and the weapons were paper, and the casualties were measured in years. "How did it go?" she said. "The way it needed to go." She nodded. "The audit will take 6 months," he said, possibly more. "During that time, the estate accounts will be under restriction." "I know. We will need to restructure several of the Northern Land agreements, the ones connected to the tariff amendment. It will affect the quarterly returns. I have already started modeling the adjustments." She looked at him. "I have been managing this estate's accounts since the 2nd year of our marriage. You just did not know it because I used Corwin's name on the external correspondence." He stared at her. "Corwin's name. You read Corwin's correspondence. You did not read mine." A long silence. "How much of what I thought was Corwin's work?" "Most of the last 8 years." He looked at the ceiling. Something moved across his face that was not quite laughter and not quite grief, and occupied the uncomfortable territory where those two things discover they are closer neighbors than either of them would prefer. God, he said. It came out like something drained. You had a capable estate manager, Evelina said. You simply had the wrong name for her. He looked back down at her. The light was doing the honest thing it did at this angle, showing the lines in both their faces, the specific erosion of years that had not been kind to either of them, the evidence of a life that had been harder than it should have been, and had made them both, in different ways, into people who were built for difficulty, whether they had chosen to be or not. I wasted you, he said. It was not an apology. It was a reckoning. The specific statement of a man doing the accounting of his own decisions and finding, at the end of the ledger, a number he cannot argue with. Yes, she said. You did. She did not soften it. She did not add qualifications, or grace notes, or the small mercy of a but on the end. She let it be what it was, because after 14 years of absorbing every impact in silence, she had earned the right to let the truth stand on its own without cushioning. He received it the way a man receives something he has been handed and has no choice but to hold. They walked out of the council building together into the winter courtyard where the carriages were waiting, their breath turning visible in the cold air, their footsteps leaving twin tracks in the thin layer of snow that had fallen since morning. Not side by side, exactly. There was still too much distance, too much history, too much that had been done and not done, and said and not said for the geography between them to have rearranged itself in 2 days. But closer than they had walked in years. The months that followed were not redemption. Evelina did not believe in the word, which implied a single transaction that cleared all debts. What happened instead was slower and less dramatic and more real. The specific, unglamorous work of rebuilding a structure that had been compromised from the inside, which required tearing out the damaged parts and replacing them with something that could actually bear weight. Cedric dismissed 4 advisors who had been part of Seraphine's network. He restored the $73,000 from his personal estate reserves before the audit was complete. Not because the law required it, but because the law requiring it would have meant the villages the military infrastructure fund was supposed to serve would wait 6 months for money they needed now. 3 northern villages received road repairs that had been delayed for 2 years. A 4th received the grain reserve allocation that had been rerouted by the tariff amendment the previous winter. These were not grand gestures. They did not appear in any public record. They were the work of a man who had spent 41 years building an empire on the premise that power was the point, discovering, at significant personal cost, that power is not a destination, it is a tool, and tools that are never used for anything useful are just weight. He did not become a different man. He became a more honest version of the man he had always been. Still hard, still direct, still constitutionally incapable of softness in the ways that softness was easy for other people, but present. The word Evelina had used in the study, the night of the documents and the fire and the ash, present in the council meetings, present in the estate decisions, present in the corridor when she passed him on her way to the archive, in a way that was not performance or strategy but simply the act of not looking away. Evelina ran the estate openly now, not through Corwin's name, her name on her own correspondence, in her own clear direct handwriting that looked like her voice sounded. No flourishes, no excess, just the exact words required to convey the exact meaning intended. The court noticed. Courts always notice when the distribution of actual power diverges from the official title structure. Noble women who had spent years offering her careful sympathy began seeking her counsel. Minor lords who had previously addressed every letter to the Duke started sending duplicates to the Duchess. It happened incrementally, the way all real shifts happen, not with an announcement, but with the slow accumulation of people making the practical assessment of where the competence actually resided. Margot noticed it first. She mentioned it one morning over black tea in the West Wing study, with the satisfaction of a woman whose long patience had finally been justified by evidence. "They are calling you the real Duke," she said, in the lower council, not as an insult. "I know," Evelina said. "Does it bother you?" Evelina looked out the window at the Blackthorn Palace grounds, where the spring had arrived quietly and turned the snow-flattened gardens into something that was beginning, cautiously, to grow again. The fountain in the center courtyard had been unfrozen for 3 weeks. The hedges were producing their first thin green edges. The palace looked, from this angle, in this light, like a building that had survived something and was not entirely sure what to do next, which was, she thought, a reasonable response to survival. "No," she said. "It does not bother me." 1 year after the winter masquerade, another ball filled Blackthorn Palace. Not the same ball. The winter masquerade was a different event now, stripped of several of the traditions that had accumulated under the old court structure. The mandatory mask requirement was relaxed. The seating arrangements were reorganized to reflect the post-audit council composition. The guest list was smaller by 60 names, the 60 names being the people whose presence had been maintained for Seraphine's purposes rather than Blackthorn's. The ballroom was still the ballroom. The chandeliers still hung like frozen constellations. The marble still reflected the undersides of gowns. The music still played. But the room had a different quality, lighter, somehow. Not in the literal sense. In the way a house feels different after something that was wrong with it for a long time has been found and fixed. The same walls, the same floors, but the air moving through them in a way it could not before. Evelina stood near the east column. She wore a gown the color of old bronze, not blue, not the gray of careful invisibility. No mask. She had not worn a mask since the night she stood on the south terrace and began dismantling the world as it was in order to build the world as it should be. Cedric found her at 10:30. He moved through the crowd the same way he always had, that particular quality of weather moving through a valley. But the crowd's response was different. They did not just move for him. They also looked at her, the woman standing at the column with her hands unfolded and her face entirely visible. And there was something in their looking that had not been there before. Not pity. Not performance of sympathy. Attention. The genuine kind. The kind that accumulates when a person has demonstrated, over the course of a year of difficult and unglamorous work, that they are someone worth watching. He stopped in front of her. "You look like you own the room," he said. "I manage the room," she said. "There is a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not exactly a smile. It was the expression of a man who has developed, late in life, the specific appreciation for precision that comes from having spent too long being careless with words. He offered his hand, palm up, a question rather than a command. She looked at it. She looked at his face, the iron-colored eyes, the jaw that still looked like it had been designed by someone who hated softness, the gray at his temples that had spread this year from a thread to a streak, as if the year's events had taken a toll that showed up in his hair rather than his posture, because his posture was not the kind of thing that admitted damage. She thought about 14 years. About the frame and the portrait and the tool of composure she had built from the material of her own pain. She thought about Tomlin's shaking hands in the snow, and Dara in the textile district alley, and Fenwick's face going pale over a foreign seal, and Margot's steady presence through all of it, the kind of loyalty that does not require an audience to sustain itself. She thought about what it had cost. All of it. Not just the year of evidence gathering, and the night of the fire and the council proceeding, the years before that. The long, patient, expensive work of becoming someone who could survive the things that happened to her and still have something intact at the end. She placed her hand in his. They moved on to the floor, and the crowd shifted the way crowds shift. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the specific, almost unconscious adjustment of people registering that something has changed in the room and reorganizing themselves around the new fact of it. They danced. Not perfectly. There was too much history between them for perfect, and perfect had never been the point. What they managed was present, both of them, in the same space, at the same time, not performing for the room and not hiding from it either. At the edge of the floor, a young noblewoman leaned toward her companion and said something in a low voice. Her companion looked at the dancing couple and nodded. The whisper moved through the room. Whispers always do. But this time it was not about scandal or betrayal or the Duke's mistress or the quiet Duchess who could not hold her husband. This time it was about the woman who had faced the most dangerous conspiracy in a generation and taken it apart with patience and precision and the particular courage that does not announce itself. The courage that shows up every day, in a building that does not see it and does the work anyway. Evelina felt the shift in the room without looking for it. She had spent 14 years being invisible. She knew the exact texture of a space when it began, finally, to see her. She did not adjust her posture. She did not perform for it. She simply continued to dance, and the dancing was enough. There is a particular kind of strength that the world does not recognize until it has already finished its work. It does not stand at the front of rooms. It does not require witnesses. It builds in the quiet, in the years that look like nothing from the outside, in the steady accumulation of watching and learning and waiting and knowing that the moment will come, and that when it does, everything will depend on being ready. Evelina Ashcombe had been ready for 14 years. The ball continued. The music played. The chandeliers threw their chandelier light over everything, surgical and honest. The same light that had illuminated her humiliation and now illuminated something else entirely. And when the crowd bowed as she passed, not to the Duke on her arm, but to her, the small, almost imperceptible inclination of heads that courts offer to people they have decided to respect, she accepted it the way she accepted everything that was finally, irrevocably hers, without surprise, without performance, simply and completely as her due.